Missing a couple people this week. I didn't see Sharon last week or this week. I hope she's all right. I hope she's having a vacation somewhere, having a lovely time. But with or without, let's get our text up here and start working on it. We're doing paragraphs 14 and 15, chapter 5 today. We started into paragraph 14 last time, but there's some very interesting things that I was saving last week that we can kick into this week. All right.
Well, slaves would pray in private, wouldn't they?
Yes.
The people that are the elite set can pray publicly because they all agree
Yes.
with each other.
So just for the recording, hello everybody. Welcome to the Kenneth Smith seminar, Millennia and Microcosm, week 135. Is it 135? Am I counting right? And we're continuing our way through this book, Millennia and Microcosm, written by philosopher Kenneth Smith in the years 1998 to 2000 or so. And it hasn't been published yet. It was the individual chapters were published as articles in a column called End Times at the back of a magazine called the Comics Journal. And David and I are pulling it together into a book form, but it's the same text. And in this seminar, we are doing a deep dive into this text because Kenneth writes in such a dense, allusive style that it takes some work to unpack what all his references are and the way that he uses his terminology. Chapter 5 introduces the section on medieval civilization, which goes for the next several chapters. And so it's a chapter full of contrasts. It's all about the contrast between the ancient world and the medieval world that rose up to replace it, the medieval worldview that rose up from inside the ancient culture, from within the ancient epoch to overthrow it. As Augustine summarizes, it's the city of God is at war with the city of man, where the ancient Roman Empire is perceived as the best that men can do is this utter corruption of the late Roman Empire. And in its place, the medievals want to erect something that can't be corrupted because and that's all good, that's all knowing. Oh, is it? I guess it is. It's Happy Shamrock Day. So last week we finished up paragraph 13 and got partway through paragraph 14. This week I want to take us through paragraph 14 in more detail, particularly midway through the paragraph. He's talking about what the function of the Greek mythoi was and the way that its purpose was to guide people to be what the ancients considered moral. That is, it's not about who's sleeping with whom. It's about, although that's a minor part of morality, that's the small change of morality, I guess you'd say. But it's largely about, can you teach people to take responsibility for their own character, for their own assumptions, for their own worldview? Can they learn to cultivate themselves as responsible adults? Or are they just going to be passive symptoms of whatever their character happens to be at the moment they're acting? And to them, that's a moral question. And that people who are incapable of taking responsibility, people who say, you made me angry, so whatever I did when I was angry, that's your fault. People who reason like that, they may have the bodies of adults, but they have the minds of children. They're just not formed. They're morally incompetent from the ancient perspective. You have to get to the point where you say, okay, yeah, I felt angry when you did that, but it's my feelings, not yours. You didn't open my head and pour the feelings into me as a brainwashing exercise. It's my job now that I've detected anger in my reaction to take responsibility for what I'm going to do next.
Your
Right?
mind was colonized. Accept the truth.
Say that again.
Your mind has been colonized. Accept the truth. This is the new one. Mental
Yes.
colonization. I'm not responsible for the way I feel.
Yes.
I'm a victim.
Yes. Yes. Well, and that's the natural state for a doulos or a benausos to have. The doulos has the character that is the default result of the way that they were brought up, strongly influenced by their feelings, their experiences, their appetites. It's characterized by a strong connectivity to their native feelings and to their sensations, but which gives us, so there's a certain element of reality that's baked into their behavior. But along with that is baked parochialism, right? That they are only really being guided by their own. this is thus idiota, right? They're guided by their own feelings and experiences, and they're not dilating their mind enough to consider the larger picture, the larger patterns, the history of people having thought about these things before them, what other people are experiencing, and so on. So, a Banausos pushes off against that naive, parochial, colonized character, the character that is the default result of their upbringing, and says, I want to take charge of myself. I don't want to just blindly react to everything. I want to take charge. This is why Hegel uses the term being in itself for a doulos. It is what it is, versus being for itself. I've taken responsibility for myself, and I've decided, these are the ways I want to behave. These are the reactions I want to have. They systematize their thought. They systematize their behavior. Typically, you see this with people who rise up within a craftsmanship guild, right? The rise from apprentice to journeyman to master is about learning the discipline and imposing the discipline on yourself, and not just reacting blindly, but learning the rules and patterns. This is what happens in an education process when you learn logic, when you learn math. All of these things are about systematizing and abstracting away, negating the blind reactive side. But the problem is that you're moving from an emotive, experiential colonization of the mind, which is very parochial and limited in its self-awareness, into a different kind of colonization, in which you've colonized your brain with ideologies, with mathematics, with logic, with the laws of society, what you have to do to advance within a police guild. All of these things are guided by a set of rules that thinks for you. It's like your noesis is a parasite in your brain that's a little calculator that's busy learning systems of calculation and then applying them and trying to overrule your feelings and your sensations and your experiences and say, you should do things this way. It's like the difference between naive art and educated art, right? Naive art is what you get out of a 2-year-old or a 5-year-old or a 10-year-old. But after people have gone through art school, you get educated art where people have learned the theory of contrast and pattern and rhythm, and Phil could talk to us for hours about all the different things you learn in art school about how to think about art, how to look at art, how to structure your art, how do you work the materials to bring your vision to. All of that stuff is noetic, right? And it's the kind of thing you don't know until you've been educated into it, and it's a systematized kind of thinking. But the Greeks thought, in following up on what Stephen said, that too is another form of colonization. You're colonizing yourself noetically instead of colonizing yourself gnosically. So you're not just having experiences, you're having ideas about those experiences and about what is the right way to channel it and what is the wrong way to channel it. And that one doesn't become, from the Greek perspective, a mature adult artist until one has learned that neither form of colonization is acceptable in an adult. An adult has to learn to use those two faculties of the mind to critique each other and to obtain an heuristic distance, both from their own appetites and feelings on the one hand, and on the other hand, from one's ideologies and systems of thinking and rules. And to learn to say, what is the deeper picture here? Where are the deeper principles? What message needs to be communicated? And what is the most persuasive way to get that across? And so they start thinking in a way that transcends both sets of colonization. And that's the first stage of development. The Aristos, it's not that there's nothing further beyond an Aristos. We wouldn't really know. Our societies have been held back so far for so long. It's that the heuristic stage of development is the very first stage of development at which one is not a slave to one or the other of the two forms of colonization, the basic faculties of the brain. There could be all kinds of stages of development after the Aristos. We just don't get to see them. We never get that far. We're still stuck on whether or not we should allow Aristoi to exist anywhere or not. So for the Greeks, all of this stuff that Stephen's alluded to, this is moral. These are moral issues. Because the Greeks say, can you be moral if all you're doing is acting out like a puppet of your appetites and experiences and feelings? Or are you just a symptom of those things then? I mean, it's like the insanity defense. If you don't have a grasp on reality, can we hold you responsible? You didn't know what you were doing. Well, neither does a doulos from the ancient perspective. So doulos is a human halfwit who's operating only on a gnosic side and hasn't fully developed their noetic side. But from the ancient perspective, noesis is another half-wit strategy. They're also not responsible for their actions. They can't be moral either, because whatever ideology they subscribe to, the ideology is thinking for them. They're trying to follow the rules as best they can, whether the rules are the rules of money or the rules of a guild and how you climb, whether they're the rules of a discipline like computer programming. They're rules, they're systems of thought, and they think for you. And therefore, what individuality do you have? You're just an expression of those things. It's not until you free yourself from both of those things, take responsible for their products and say, all of this is my bullshit and I have to own it. I can't say, not only can't I say you made me angry, so it's your fault, I also can't say I was just following orders, so I'm a moral person. It's okay if I, exterminate the Jews because I was ordered to do so and it's moral to follow orders. Like, no, noetic thinking is not moral either. Neither of them is moral. You're moral at the point when you can question both of those contributions and actually rise up to the level of taking responsibility for it. So this is what he's talking about when he in paragraph 14 when he keeps talking about the moral quality of Greek mythoi and Greek religion. This is to the ancients, this is what morality is, not did you obey God's commandments and did you sleep with your neighbor. So that's little stuff. So Phil, tell us what's on your mind.
Yes, as you were talking about that, it occurred to me about Plato, the myth of the cave versus ascending the ladder to I guess to the forms. It seems to me that's kind of a false analogy because once you climb up to the ladder and begin to think about mathematics and language and all that, you call into another system of traps. So I was thinking, well, the problem is that he's constructed a model in which you negate it perhaps too much the shadows uh, that allow for an interaction. Then I'm thinking, well, how do you construct a thing where you could kind of look one direction and the other direction? You kind of have a swivel head, kind of like how the Indians, I mean the Asian Indians, they kind of have this thing where it's kind of like waving back and forth, yes and no, it's not like bowing your head and like this. So so that's interesting. And I'm thinking, well, what if you have a circular path in which you run back and forth? I mean, in a circle, you see both of it. Then it occurred to me, you know, the double helix, it seems like the ladder that climbs up, right? Because at every rung you climb up or climb down, there's a duality that interface with things. And I wonder if that structure came about not through man's wisdom, but through nature in some sort of like, well, I'll put it in quotes, stupid way. It seems to be a structure that's very interesting, a double helix, because you are always caught in between the two relationships, but you are still ascending. So that's a very, very interesting structure. So why have why haven't we invented a double helix uh, staircase? I guess the spiral staircase comes a little bit close to that, because you're going around as you go up. It's like, yeah, you're seeing the whole spectrum as you're ascending to the second floor or the third floor or whatever. So how come how come our world is constructed where we don't have spiral staircases? Well, we do, but it's not a kind of a serious kind of ladder, a step. So, yeah, maybe the double helix. We should forget about how important that structure was when we discovered it. So I'll just leave it at that. The double helix is the model that Plato didn't actually ever figure it out.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? They did so much work with geometry, and yet here's this possibility sort of missing, as far as we can tell. They built staircases, Oh, they never built a spiral staircase. I mean, maybe they did and they fell down, but we don't have any evidence of it. So morality, at the end of sentences 1 through 3 of paragraph 14, he talks about this idea of that for the Greeks, what is moral is focused on soulcraft. It's focused on self-cultivation. And this is based on this idea that you don't get to move from you don't get to move from doulos to benausos without engaging in self-cultivation, but it can be an oblivious self-cultivation. You can pick up a discipline without ever understanding exactly what you're doing to yourself. It's easy to make the process from doulos to benausos without ever becoming conscious of the nature within yourself. You become more conscious of the nature around you. And you say it's a lawful nature and it follows certain rules. Like my society has a social ladder. If I want to climb it, then I'm going to have to follow certain rules and engage in certain behaviors. They're very external, right? You can become a benausos through these external processes, but you can't become an aristos through external processes. You have to turn inside yourself and say, when I went from doulos to benausos, what did I become? What did I gain and what did I lose? For all that initially I was focused in that transition on the inadequacies of douleia, what are the inadequacies I still have within me as a benausos that I can't transcend by being even more of a benausos than I am now? The discovery that it's not about 2 points, but that you have to triangulate and move off. All of that involves the requirement that you engage in anthropoculture on yourself, self-anthropoculture. Now, what's interesting about this is that to get to an aristos, you have to learn to govern yourself. But as he's pointing out in the rest of that sentence, he says, at the same time, it conceives humans to be radically self-governing for better or for worse. And we're going to talk about what that means, but in the sentences that follow. But the critical thing here is this idea that all the stuff Aristotle said about government, good government versus bad government, the forms that can either be with sophrosune or without sophrosune. And if they're without sophrosune, they have all the same external structure, but they're not actually government. The tyranny of the majority, what he called democracy, says is not the real democracy. A real democracy, and I can't remember, it might be a republic, I can't remember the word he used for the real democracy, is made up of people who have a commitment to sophrosune, and by combining that commitment in the act of governance, they are able to give their society some sophrosune that it otherwise would not have. So if you have a government by the majority, but they don't have sophrosune, then they have no sophrosune to give to society, and the society doesn't acquire that sophrosune to help direct it in a healthy direction. And therefore, what they're doing, like in the United States, when we go to the polls, what we're doing is not government. It is ersatz government. It's like the saccharin of sugar. It's like as saccharin is to sugar, so going to the polls in the United States is to governance. There's no actual governance taking place because it lacks sophrosune. So this issue is Kenneth was trying to make a different point here, but he knows this stuff really well. And so it's all tied up in here, even though he's not focusing on it in the moment. This is one of those places where it gets really dense because he's sort of skittering between several topics at the same time. And one of them is this issue. So an aristos has at least a partial capacity for self-governance in that they have taken responsibility for their character and they're engaged in the process of trying to cultivate their character into a healthier direction than where they are now. And that's the heart of governance in a nutshell. They may not be very good at it because they're mortals, and we remember the lyric poet's complaints about the stupidity of being a mortal person. So it's not governance in an absolute sense, but it's at least governance in a partial sense. There's at least an awareness of the necessity of governance, the necessity of sophrosune, and the necessity of replacing the current generation of defective character through a process of cultivation with a character that has a greater capacity for sophrosune in the future. than it has today. And all of that becomes part of the process of governance. That is, governance isn't just about making the decisions, it's also about transforming the character of those who are making the decisions so that tomorrow's decisions will be better than yesterday's decisions were, right? If that's not present, it's also not governance, right? It's because otherwise it's too externally focused. So when he says it conceives humans to be radically self-governing, he's not saying everybody has sophrosune, even though to the ancients, to be truly self-governing would be to have sophrosune, because otherwise it's not governance. Yourself something else that you're doing to yourself. So we have a word problem here. This occasionally happens with Kenneth's writing. He was thinking about something else and he was in a hurry and he didn't find exactly the right word. He's close. But we need a word that encompasses both self-governance and self-direction when that self-direction lacks sophrosune and therefore doesn't qualify as governance. We've talked about how Aristotle makes the distinction between the animals and plants and fungi that all have sophrosune, and therefore they are engaged in self-governance. But we don't have sophrosune unless we're lucky enough to have a little of it from our acculturation, our upbringing, and our self-cultivation of our character. And then we have some sophrosune, and therefore some of our self-direction might qualify as self-governance. So when he says for better or for worse, he's alluding to this idea that the missing word that he didn't use, whatever it should have been, would allow for, on the one hand, on the better hand, for self-governance with sophrosune, but on the other hand, it would also include the possibility of self-direction without sophrosune. That's the thing that human beings are radically that thing, not self-governance per se. So I'm doing a little correction here, because I'm sure this is what he means. I mean, this is how he thinks about these issues. This is how he talks about these issues. I'm sure this is what he means, and this is compatible as well with Heraclitus and Aristotle. So it's one of the things that makes reading Kenneth Smith tricky. You got to read enough Kenneth Smith and think about him enough and study the people he's pointing at enough that you can start to notice when, as a mortal, he too has made an imperfect word choice. It isn't exactly the word that he wants. It's close, and it gets you into the right neighborhood. But when you wrestle with the issues and look at the word again, you can see that it's not exactly the right word. Self-governance is the for better one, but it's not the for worse one, and he means both here. Human beings are radically self-directing, sometimes in a healthy way, sometimes not in a healthy way. And I'm going to call on Phil in a second, but I want to finish this thought with the idea that all that talk we did about entheos and enthusiasm, that's what we have instead of sophrosune. We don't have the compass in the brain that points in the direction of something healthy, but we have a pointer in the brain that points in the direction of whatever we're enthusiastic about it, for better or for worse. Right? This is what he's talking about. Those enthusiasms, that entheos state that Cornford writes about. That's the self-direction. We're possessed by the daimon. The daimon is a spirit. The spirit moves us. Yeah, self-management, self-motivation suggests, Joe. There might be the word might be in here somewhere. It's hard to say. We'd have to really play with it. Maybe it can be part of our homework to think about that. So, Phil, what's on your mind?
Yeah, what's on my mind in some ways is a continuation of the spiral staircase, but in a different way. Because it seems to me like there are two dimensions, the external world and the inner world. And it seems to me, Narcissus, when he looked into the water, he saw the surface of himself, the reflection. And the problem is that he didn't understand that there's two dimensions of reflection. One is looking at the outer world and seeing how beautiful or ugly something is. And of course, he was beautiful, so he just sort of like was very, very pleased, he just couldn't get over himself, so to speak. But reflection is also looking inwards. He should have, because what looking inwards, it allows you to proceed unto yourself. That means in the future. And it must be done simultaneously. The problem is that it comes down to language. Language is, you have descriptive language, which scientists are very fond of, describing the phenomena, how it happens. But that language is structured in a declaratory statement, the destiny, we're going to get to the end. So to the degree that those questions involved, it is wrapped around within the destiny of what the end is. And I think the problem with that is, in some sense, you always have to reflect on the immediate relationship uh, to the end. And that gets back to when I said, when I was studying Chinese, and this guy, who was from China, actually he was from Taiwan. He described the sentences. He said, well, there's declarative and there's interrogative. And I said to myself, I have to correct him. It's an interrogative, right? But then I stopped myself because I said, well, maybe he's right. You know, you need to interrogate yourself, your inner self, all the time, not just like wait till you get to the end. Is that, yeah, look, I knew we were right to begin with. So the interrogative is another kind of spiral staircase to a certain degree. It's like, and you can't wait like, oh, yeah, that's a good question. I'll wait, for a month, and then I'll have an idea how it relates to the destiny of where we're going. So the declarative, in some sense, and that's usually the sentences we use, usually is destined to look beyond without thinking about the immediate reflection that we see in the water. And what's holding up Narcissus is not that he couldn't see and appreciate things, he couldn't see beyond himself, into himself. And so he struck, and I was also thinking of Echo, who uh, loved Narcissus, and Echo is also interesting in a sense, but Echo is more internalized because the voice came from within and bounced out and came back, which is but at least it bounced out into the world. So yeah, so that's very, very interesting. This duality that one always have to equivocate, and now I'm using the word that quite often, uh, around because you're looking, you like the Indians, go like this. You're looking and popping back and forth, yeah, maybe, like yes and no, yeah. So I mean, I have to learn how to make that correct. And
It's a
become
great gesture. It's worth practicing.
you're right. Yeah. I'm not quite sure, but yeah, maybe. Okay. All right. I'll just leave it at that. It seems to be, this mirror, and I think Socrates, about how he constructed the ladder, the representation is the lowest form,
Yes.
right? In fact, in some sense, if you did it right in terms of doing art, you know, the representation is not just, a declarative statement. I got that right. It's a reflection of that, but it's just a reproduction. But you are questioning that. And I mean, that's where something like Cubism came into being, it's like a lot of internal questions. How does it relate uh,
Yes.
to the things itself? So, okay, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, the double helix is a really handy metaphor here for a number of reasons, and one of them is this idea that living things, if Nora Bateson is right and Samathasy is the definition of life, that you're in a perpetual learning relationship with your environment, and that's what distinguishes you from a rock. The rock can't learn anything about its environment. It can't change its behavior to adjust to its environment. It just does what a rock does, blindly ignoring.
Let me interrupt you for a second because I had a thought about that too. Like nature does interesting things, like when you look at the optics of the optics projects image upside down. So it's false, but somehow the relationship between the optics and the neurological system turns it right side up. Like so so nature developed that, like damn, the whole world's upside down. Like how do you get it right side up? It's like, yeah. So the dual process, once again, is kind of like, ascending to the cave, the shadows, and then you need both in a sense to correct it. That's actually the way it looks.
Yes.
Not
Yes.
not upside down, It's like otherwise, if we only had the upside down image. In fact, I asked a perceptual psychology that once. I said, you know, after he showed it, and I'm saying like he was showing something else, but because even then I knew that there was some experiments with people with false glasses that turn the thing back upside down again, I guess the mind. So in some sense, I said, how does it correct itself, And he says, no, no. He said eventually what happened is people get used to that. It's not like, like as the days goes on, it rotates back. No, he says they just get used
Yes.
to that and they're actually thinking upside down and it just seems normal. So so that was a very, very interesting situation. Yeah. Upside down is right side up.
That's right. Thanks, Phil. So the idea of semathesy is that when when the world changes, you pay attention to the world, and you, as a result, you notice that it has changed, and you change your strategy to adjust to it. And that's something an amoeba can do, or a turtle can do that. But a rock that's been carved and painted to look like a turtle can't do that because it has less life than the actual turtle has. So it reminds me strongly of Deming's continuous quality improvement, which is based on this loop called plan, do, check, act, where you make your plans for how what you want to do in the world. You do those things, but then you don't just stop there, but you check, was the result of my doing what I thought it was going to be? Or is there a schism between what I thought would happen and what actually happened? Because if there's a schism, it means I'm wrong about the world and I need to adjust and you know act to revise my plans so that the next time I plan and do it's based on an improved position. Plan, do, check, act. And the result of plan, do, check, act is if you do it correctly, you're not just running in circles doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result, but instead you're in a helix where every time you come back around to plan and do again, you have a greater understanding of the consequences of your actions than you had the last time. And so it captures Samantha. His, although Deming lacked the word, effectively his system is an attempt to capture Samanthasy in industrial planning so that industrial planners can learn from their mistakes and the institution can grow. So, but that might be the single helix of Samanthasy for most living organisms. But Homo sapiens evolved into this weird state, which is what he's talking about here in sentences 3 and 4. We evolved into this weird state where our character is our second nature. We don't just have the first nature outside us, we have a second nature within us. And it too is malleable. And it too is a realm in which we can plan and do and check and act. And so, side by side with the helix that's doing PDCA, we should also have this second helix, say the ancients, in which we also evaluate how much of what went wrong was not caused by a misunderstanding of reality, but by our character being unfit to to plan correctly or to do correctly. And so to what extent does our checking and acting, to what extent should there be a second loop that's based on cultivating the inner nature alongside cultivating the outer nature? And then it's these two helixes together that sort of describe the shape of human development towards being heuristic. This is all I'm doing. I'm using terminology that the Greeks themselves didn't use here, but I'm just attempting to, using your spiral, your helix metaphor, I'm attempting to illustrate how in general they conceived of this responsibility that an adult mature human being has, that they're not just acting in the world, but they're acting inside their character too and shaping them both. And that's without that, Just like if you don't do PDCA, your factory is just running in circles, making the same mistakes over and over. Without this second helix, as to help hold up your life, you're just running in circles inside your own character and therefore not developing and growing and failing to learn, where have I gone wrong because of my character and not because of anything around me? Where do I need to cultivate my character in a healthier direction to improve my ability to act out in the world and also to act inside myself and to transform myself? So there's a lot of sophistication in the way that the ancient Greeks looked at what they consider to be the moral responsibilities of self-cultivation or soulcraft. That for them, this is a complex, sophisticated area that is the defining feature of the adult mind and the adult life. James, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Thanks, Rick. I noticed you didn't mention Aristotle when you're talking about, you did mention Aristotle when you're talking about Saint-Rosini, but not Plato. So is something about Aristotle that is distinct from Plato, and also is there this kind of Saint-Rosini and Hegel? Is that dialectical process, the process of leading from douloi, monasoi, and towards aristoi in Hegel's dialectic? And do you see the difference between that kind of what Hegel did, with the system of thought, and the Nietzsche's critique? Is Nietzsche's critique bringing this kind of notion of douloi back to a more natural state, that was missing in this in Hegel's systematic thought? And so, what would you do? And also, do you see a kind of aristoi in Nietzsche's thinking?
What a great question, James. So, it was certainly Hegel's intention to capture all of the profundity of the what shall we say, naturalistic perspective on life and human character and human history that had been lost during the medieval epoch. He was deliberately trying to resurrect these ancient Greek philosophical concepts, but even though he respected them greatly, he wasn't himself an ancient Greek. So he was looking through early modern lenses and doing his best to reconstruct a philosophy that he lacked the worldview to fully perceive. And you can see ways in which he basically revolutionized modern philosophy by doing that on the one hand, but on the other hand, his work, while on the one hand very strong and solid, on the other hand, it was full of odd holes, places where it's shocking that he didn't apply his own philosophy to his own thinking. And Nietzsche takes him to task for that. And one of the places he does is he sees sort of some mechanical qualities to Hegel's dialectics, in where he applies it and where he does it. I mean, the reason is Hegel's raised as a German Lutheran Kantian, and he's dissatisfied with it. He discovers Heraclitus and Aristotle. He discovers this ancient stuff, and he imports it and tries to use it as a tool to repair or fix or upgrade his Lutheran Kantianism that he grew up with. But in the process of doing that, he's thinking about it like you think about something external to yourself that you're manipulating. He doesn't think about it in the all-pervasive, all-marinating, all-inclusive way that the Greeks did, because he just wasn't raised that way. He can't after the fact, despite his intentions, he can't move his perspective fully into that worldview. And you see it in a lot of ways. You see it in the way that he would fall for he made the mistake. He thought the I Ching was the summation of all Chinese writing, He said, well, as clever as this is, it's too primitive. You couldn't even express basic ideas like, let's have a meal, let alone philosophy. And so he decides the Chinese don't have any philosophers. This is a shocking, it's a shocking oversimplification of an entire culture. It's the kind that you make when you're still stuck within your Eurocentric perspective, and you aren't able to think about the idea that other people are just as real as you are. He's still emerging from that long 1,000 years of kind of genocidal medieval perspective that says there's one right culture, there's one right religion, there's he's German, there might be only one right language, right? He's still got the monomania that he's only partway separated himself from. And as long as he's got that, he's not going to be able to see the world around him as it actually is. He's only going to be able to see it as in relation to his quasi-genocidal monomaniacal perspective. And so he misses things. He misses that. He misses the idea as part of that, his dismissal of all other cultures and religions and languages as being incapable of helping people achieve real freedom. He says only Lutheranism, only German Lutherans know full freedom for the first time. He says, shockingly, he writes, and the Greeks couldn't have really understood freedom the way that Lutherans do. If only they could have been Lutherans, they might have understood. He says they sort of half understand freedom. He says it was an amazing breakthrough that the Greeks made, but they only made it halfway because they weren't Christian. And not being Christian, they couldn't understand freedom the way we can. And that's why once we convert everybody to Christianity, everybody will be free. He's still got that stuff in him. And this is not an authentic application of his own of his own dialectics to the world, but especially it's an overly external focus for his dialectics. He's failing to critique his own character, his own ideology, his own upbringing. We talked about this idea of two helixes being necessary for the mature adult Homo sapiens from the ancient perspective. He doesn't understand that. He doesn't realize that. And so he's not using the dialectic to critique himself. He's using it to critique his targets, like Kant or the Greeks. So yeah, I guess that's kind of what I'd say, James, is kind of the perspective here is that he has excellent intentions, but he lacks adequate introspection. From an ancient Greek perspective, he's not an adult yet. He's a kid who's been highly Banausified, who has discovered that there's limits to Banausea, and he's sort of half extricated himself from it, and then he doesn't get any further than that. So what the young Hegelians do, whether it's Kierkegaard or Nietzsche or Marx, is, among other things, they grow up with Hegelian philosophy, and as a result, it's more second nature to them than it was to Hegel. And thus, they're able to ask more probing questions than Hegel was able to ask. And it includes Nietzsche's critique of Hegel. He's able to ask questions about Hegel's character that Hegel himself couldn't ask. So it's really interesting when you study these guys. And you might think of Kenneth Smith as a next generation Hegelian from that perspective, but it goes beyond Hegel, right? Because he's using the critiques of the young Hegelians against Hegel, but he's also he's grown up with all of that and is able to immerse himself more in the ancient Greeks than even Nietzsche was. And so the result is he's able to do a better job of simulating what the ancient perspective might be. It's why I have that envy for people like Donald who went through Kenneth's classes. That thing that Kenneth could do where he could pit two philosophers against themselves and have a conversation where each of them is reacting to the other from his perspective and from his philosophy. He's essentially, in this book, he's sort of alluding to the fact that you could do that with the ancient worldview, the medieval worldview, and the modern worldview if you've immersed yourself in all three of them well enough. And then you can role play out. What would an ancient Greek really make of all this stuff? We wouldn't have been able to role play those things if it weren't for the work of Hegel and Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and the others to kind of bring this stuff back from the shadows of history. And we have to be grateful to them for the work that they did to get us this far. But we also have to recognize their limitations as, they could only get so far given where they started. And presumably someday people will get so much farther than we did on this stuff.
You think Nietzsche's perspectival, uh, you know, position kind of like takes us back to alludes to the maybe valorizes the douloid too much.
Yeah. Yeah. Nietzsche
Is it kind of
is
going backwards from? I mean, is he going backwards away from
well,
the being an Aristotle?
he's focused on the missing ingredient that Hegel, as an intellectual, Hegel sort of missed a lot, which was the vitalism, the soprasune, the attachment to what makes you feel more alive, what plugs you into health more strongly. And Nietzsche writes a great deal about this subject, really explicitly. He writes about this subject. And so when he does that, part of what he's doing, you can say that it's going back to the douloi, but I think a stronger way to put it is it's going back to the missing gnosis. If you over intellectualize the Greeks, then you admire their noetic accomplishments while failing to recognize their gnosic accomplishments. And the douloi are gnosic but lack noesis. The banausoi are noetic but lack gnosis. And an aristos is supposed to have both. So the process of as you mature and you grow from a doulos to a banausos to an aristos, the last step in the process as you're moving back to being an aristos, that mature adult human mind, involves recapturing a bunch of the lost qualities that douloi have and banausoi lack. That live wire attachment to feeling and sensation and experience and memory that can help to pull you back out of the empty abstractions of intellectualism and plug you back into the reality of the world. Right? That's to a banausos, that activity looks like you're becoming doulic. But what it actually is undoing the extremes of Banauseia to create the more whole-minded, dialectical, palintropic balance of an Aristos. Because a true Aristos, we hypothesize, lacking any examples in the modern world to work with, but a true Aristos is just as comfortable and just as uncomfortable with their feelings and appetites as they are with their ideologies and education and systems of thinking. That they're not letting one eclipse the other, but they're harnessing them together to critique each other. And Hegel was not. Hegel was a very Banausic guy. He was not a deeply emotional, experiential kind of guy. So I'm sure, James, you're right that if Hegel were to critique Nietzsche, he would say, "Man, you were way too emotional. You almost seem like a doulos, man. You just seem so, but he might have recognized what he was doing. It's not that he's certainly Hegel wrote about the mature adult human mind, and he recognized that it has to recapture those qualities. But that doesn't mean, even though he'd figured it out intellectually and wrote about it so clearly, it doesn't mean he would have been comfortable doing it. I mean, he was very intellectual. He was very, noetic in the way he did these things. Those are great questions. Phil, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, after your discussion about that, it just seems to me we have to become aware how much we are encloaked in a culture, whatever culture that might be. So we are by nature already biased, despite what it is, because I was thinking about that because it just seems like the Middle Ages, particularly Thomas Aquinas, once again, I don't know enough about them, because this ideology of something that's beyond this world has almost entirely negated the world itself in some sense. And I could see how, the early moderns into the later moderns are strapped by that residual conflation in a sense, because when I'm thinking about Kant, I mean, to the degree that I know Kant, I mean that Kant is very complicated, but he seemed to have this idea, and his conceptual part seemed a lot like Plato, but he does make for like correction in philosophy about not overdoing it. So he had practical wisdom as well. But the practical wisdom seems to me, by his nature, to be a supplement to the structure of the forms themselves and thinking that feeds into it. And instead of developing this other side, he just have that feed in to it so you could develop the forms and the structure themselves. And so in some sense, he's not totally one-dimensional, but the other dimension is much thinner than it should be. And so in some sense, I think Heidegger was trying to take that thin part and boost it up, but he might have overdone it too. So I don't know. And so in some sense, because the problem with Heidegger is that, I mean, I like his philosophy of trying to bring that back, but he became so parochial in his own way that he didn't see that was restrictive itself. So yeah, I think this sort of self-interrogation is a, it's a very important part. And it's a difficult part because your feelings are this way or your ideas are this way, and it's like to unscrew the screw. It's kind of difficult, particularly when it's sort of pretty much rusted and welded into to the bolt that you can't unscrew it anymore. So
Yes.
yeah, so yeah, yeah, I think you know you begin to wonder, yeah, as open-minded as I am, as you are, you wonder like what little torques are inside you that keeps you from being more expansive because I mean, I consider myself an extremely tolerant person. But there is a line when I said, no, no, you've gone too far, and maybe I should be a little bit more open to that. But I don't want to get to the point where I don't have any judgment. Like, oh, yeah, 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 he's fine, everybody's fine. Like, that doesn't work either. So,
Right.
like, so how do you find the point where you're like, it's time to shut the gates of the city? How at what time do you open the gates? I
Yes.
Isn't that what we're dealing with at the southern border? Like, let's build the wall. I mean, yeah, there's some reason for you want to build a wall, but there's also other reasons you shouldn't build a wall. So it's like it gets very confusing. So yeah,
Yes.
so I don't know. That's it.
Yeah. And Kenneth says these are exactly the sorts of issues where you see cultures splitting between the ones that have an adequate tolerance of nuance and complexity, where you can wrestle with these issues. It's okay to wrestle with the issues and to try to figure them out, versus the kinds of cultures that are so extremely pragmatic that they have a contempt for thinking about these complicated, nuanced issues. Because they're like, if it seems complicated, you must not understand it. Everything says the pragmatist is ultimately simple. And if you're dithering at all, that's not about reality. That's you. You're the problem. We'll move you aside and put somebody in charge who has less nuance, less appreciation for complexity, and will just bulldoze through the situation and come up with a black or white answer. And he says, the Romans were a whole lot more pragmatic and less tolerant of nuance than the Greeks were. And moderns are even more ultra pragmatic. We want to know how we're going to pay our bills and make a bunch of money. We don't care about the consequences of our actions. That is, as they say, in the federal government where I worked, that's not during the healthy period, but during the sick period that led to the decline of medical informatics. They said that's an SCP, that's somebody else's problem. And the goal is to move all complicated, nuanced issues. The goal of the ultra pragmatist is to move all those issues onto somebody else's desk, and then because the system will never give them time to finish them, so they're going to fail when they try to resolve those issues. They'll be under pressures that are unrealistic for some of these things take time to think through, right? To wrestle with and think about. And as long as you have a go, go, go deadline driven system, you'll never do justice to those issues. So then the goal in such a bureaucracy becomes to make sure that those issues aren't on my desk, because whoever has them, it's hot potato. Whoever has those issues is set up for failure. And then the system fails to recognize that there's a reason why it doesn't adequately deal with nuanced, complex situations like the ones that demand the kind of consideration you're talking about. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I was just going to say, in pursuant to this whole period, we're talking about this Middle Ages or this medieval period, and something which fascinates me is the nature of what went on long before. It's in the pre-axial age, or the dawn of the axial age. In the dawn of the axial age, people have an experience of what they believe is their spirit. It has problems. Or they go to the Egyptian temple and say, hey guys, can you help me with my spirit? Or you go to the Orphic mysteries or something like that. And actually there was a substantial chunk, potentially a substantial chunk of a person's life was going into what is my spirit. Now, when the church gains power, or the Western sort of monotheism, and this is very typical of Islam as well, we have God as the cosmic dictator. And that peculiar instance in the Middle Ages where the Western Church was having a split with the Eastern Church, and the Western Church decided to more or less ban the concept of the individual spirit. Once it had been spirit, soul and body. And the church said, well, look, we have an all-powerful spirit in the universe and his helpers. We'll work on the conditions of the spirit, and after all, we can always defer to the all-powerful if we really get stuck. You guys don't bother with your individual spirit anymore. In fact, it doesn't exist. You're a soul, you're a body. Be happy and content with that. And if there's any questions, you'll die one day. And if you go upwards, you can have a talk with God about it. They were living in the dictatorship of the spirit, but their own individual spirit had been sort of wiped, sort of erased, sort of imposed upon in such an extreme fashion. You know, don't bother with your spirit, personal, individual spiritual question anymore. Don't take up time pursuing that. We're the experts. We're discussing it with God. Don't worry. If you've got a problem, it's all going to be worked out one day. You don't need any input on your own part, other than paying attention to the church. So thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, it's interesting the way that the medieval epoch has these huge splits inside of it. It's the great contradiction of the medieval epoch is that even though the goal was through genocide to achieve an orthodoxy so that God could rule the world, in practice, there was no orthodoxy. There was a central orthodoxy that wanted to be in charge of everything, but they were utterly dependent upon all these other elements who didn't agree with them about fundamental things. So that, like you say, the split between the Western Church and the Eastern Church. You know, the Eastern Church had more of a place for individual spirit, while the Western Church was sort of suppressing it, trying to achieve this obedience out of everybody, you know, to follow the secular authorities who gained their authority from, you know, the religious authorities who gained their authority from God. They wanted to have this big, clean pyramid of spirit where the source of spirit is up at the top and everybody else has diminishing levels of it. But it corresponds with a kind of infantilization as well about, you know, how much autonomy will people be allowed to have in this society in order to act and make decisions. You also get this huge split between early medieval versus late medieval. A lot of what we're talking about is the gradual ossification towards the late medieval. But in the early medieval, many of the early church fathers, they thought people did have individual spirits and they were very important. So there's this kind of settling out process that happens over this 1,000 years. It's interesting. Before I call on Phil, I want to get us into the next sentence because this although in the sections that I copied over, it's in a different clump. It follows naturally from sentence 3, and it's got a lot of juiciness in it. There's a thing I'm building up to today. We'll get to. I think we're going to get to it. That's about the oracle and the temple at Delphi. I made it. What was for me a big aha experience and discovery a month ago, and I've been twiddling my fingers, all excited about introducing it to the seminar when we get to this spot in this paragraph. But first, the last piece of setup. Sentence 4: like every natural being, they, i.e., people, have an impulse of self-direction, which he's echoing what he said before. That is the very quintessence of their nature. I'm going to save the second half of the sentence for later, but that first part, that is the quintessence of their nature. That when we say nature, right? Remember when we're talking Kenneth Smith, when we're talking to ancient Greeks, nature and character are almost synonyms for each other. They're two different perspectives on the same thing. The Greeks used nature the same way we do, in the sense that it can mean what we're all in nature, nature's all around us, but it can also mean, what is my character? What is my nature? How do I behave? And so when the Greeks talk about man by nature desires to know and things like that, they are playing a word game that we have to be alive to, in which they're both talking about, the activities within nature, and they're also talking about your ethos, your character. So what does it mean to be human? When he says it's the very quintessence of their nature, he's saying that impulse of self-direction is right at the core of what it means to be a human being and not something else. And he says, like every natural being. So he's also saying, yeah, all the animals have the same self-direction, that the plants have the same self-direction, the fungus, the bacteria, all living things, including complex systems, a forest, an ocean. Each of them has its own impulse of self-direction. That's why the Greeks are obsessed with teleology and telos and these things, which they see as arising from character. So each of these things has its own character, which is its nature, which determines its impulse of self-direction. So far, so good, right? We're talking, it's like a great big fractal system. All life on Earth together has a character which has an impulse of self-direction, but also each ecosystem within that overall has its own character, which gives it an impulse of self-direction. But also each organism within that ecosystem, on and on and on, all the way down, all of this stuff. This is how the Greeks see the world. It's not made of things, it's made of nested organisms. And to be an organism is not to be some kind of biological machine. To the Greeks, they thought that was absurd. To be an organism is to have an inner nature of your own, that is your character, that directs you to want to be self-directed. You want to do the things that will honor your character. You feel this huge drive to be true to yourself. The cheetah feels it. You and I feel it. That oak tree in the backyard feels it. They need to act in ways that are consistent with their character, and that drive to be self-directing, to unfold naturally the order that is hidden within them, the seeds of the future, right? The acorn wants to become the oak, and it will take every opportunity step by step to move in that direction. That's its teleology. So this is what he's talking about here with the impulse of self-direction. He says, like every natural being, not just to reiterate that they do, but also to emphasize how different human beings are, because our impulse of self-direction isn't framed in by instincts to guarantee that the self-direction has sophrosyne. It's not guaranteed that a human being is going to do what's healthy for them. We go back to the cheetah repeatedly, and I'm doing some of this because Angelina is on the call today, and I want to make sure we don't skip past what are the central issues that we've been wrestling with here. And so one of them is this: we use the cheetah as the metaphor for any living organism. We talk about how you can't get the cheetah interested in watching old Star Trek reruns or collecting piles of money. It has no interest. You can't make it be interested in those things. Its instincts won't allow that. But it's not that it has no brain. It does have a brain, but the brain focuses its unconscious in the direction of being aware of and interested in the things that are necessary for the cheetah's survival, and away from the things that are not. The things that are not sort of vanish into the background of the cheetah's awareness. You can put a pile of bills and it'll sniff it and make sure it's not food or a threat, but then it loses interest and moves on. It fades out of its awareness, and it can't stop thinking about, one of a short list of possibilities. The gazelle, if the cheetah's hungry, the gazelle is the most beautiful thing the cheetah's ever seen, and it can't take its eyes off it, and it wants to unite with it. And what it's going to do with it, that comes later. But right now, it's so pretty. It's so shiny. It can't stop looking. It's so nice. But if the cheetah's not hungry, if the cheetah's just eaten, then maybe what the cheetah can't stop thinking about is how it's a mess. It's bloody and it needs to take a bath. And, other things are not interesting. It's like, yeah, there's other gazelles, but my stomach is full. And so the thing that's really interesting to me right now as a stealth hunter is I can't stink up the savannah. I've gotta be pristine, clean, keen, good kitty, right? That the cheetah needs to be clean. Or if it's got cubs, then it's Sofrosune points it at the direction of the cubs and their needs and feeding them. And so the Sofrosune doesn't just point at one thing. It's like a little Chinese menu of choices. It's got different things it can pick off the menu, but they're all going to be delicious cheetah things that the cheetah, that they have a role to play at this time and this place in the cheetah's life. This is Sofrosune. This is the compass in the brain that the Greeks understood all living organisms have. And that's what this teleology, this impulse of self-direction, that's what it is for every other natural being, except for Homo sapiens. Right? The Greeks see Homo sapiens as being almost the same, except lacking the frame. We don't have the compass in the brain that points to Sofrosune. We have a compass in the brain that points to whatever we happen to be enthusiastic about, which is the result of acculturation, because we're such a cultural animal, and personal experience. So I might really be enthusiastic about watching old Star Trek reruns, and you cannot get me to focus on the gazelle on the savannah to save my life, because my enthusiasm isn't for the gazelle. And it's not because that wouldn't be healthy. Maybe I'm a hunter and I really should be looking at the gazelle, but I'm a more programmable creature than the cheetah is. And so I can be programmed to be obsessed with things that are not good for me. They don't even have to be poison. They might just be irrelevant. There's an old European myth about the vampire that most Hollywood vampire stories don't have anymore, but Sesame Street had it. Its character of the Count had it. That if you threw rice on the ground in front of a vampire, it couldn't hunt you anymore. It had to stop and count all the grains of rice. It had an obsession. It had to know what the numbers were. And because of that, you could just carry around a bunch of rice in your pocket. And if you thought a vampire was coming for you, just scatter it out on the ground. And yeah, you don't need a wooden stake, right? You don't need garlic or holy crosses or anything. You just need to scatter its obsession in front of it. And immediately you disappear from the vampire's consciousness. And now it has to count. Just like on Sesame Street, one batty, 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 two batty, batty, That enthusiasm, that drive, that fascination with something that's irrelevant to the survival of the vampire, that is a pictorial description of the way that, unlike every other natural being, our impulse of self-direction is not guaranteed to point in the direction of what's healthy for us because we lack Sofrosune. It might, if we had a good culture and a good upbringing, and if we've taken on self-cultivation, but it also might not. It's luck of the draw where we find ourselves at any given moment as to whether our character points us in a healthy direction or in an unhealthy direction. Eudaimonia, a good daimon that rules over us, or dysdaimonia, a bad daimon that rules over us, like a monkey on our back that makes us want to pick up the bottle if we're an alcoholic, like my family is. So this is what he's doing in this opening half. That I said sometimes Kenneth writes very clearly and makes all the pointers you need to figure out what he's talking about. But sometimes he writes so densely and skitters through a number of dense issues that you really have to slow down and unpack what he's talking about here. So that's what he's doing in sentence 4 in the first half of it, is he's simultaneously comparing and contrasting. He's saying, like all animals, our impulse, like all living things, our impulse of self-direction is at the very heart of our nature, of our character. But unlike the rest of them, that impulse is not guaranteed to carry Sofrosune. That's our special pet trick. It both makes us more creative and more destructive. We can do wonderful acts of generosity, or we can nuke the world. It all depends on what we're enthusiastic about. And other animals don't have that problem. They're framed in. No, you can't get the cheetah to push the red button to save its life. It has no interest in exterminating all the other cheetahs or the lions or anybody else. That wouldn't even occur to it. Not because it doesn't have a brain, but because its brain has Sofrosune. And so Forsune knows that that would be a stupid thing to care about. So it doesn't care. It's not interested. It has to look at the things that it cares about. Phil, tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, what came to my mind was actually what Stephen talked about. And it's sort of interesting because I'm studying now, right now, sort of like in the meetup group of Heidegger, you know, talking about the transformation of ideas and in the philosophy to the beginning of thinking. It's interesting because like I remember when we started with the contrast between the whatness and the thatness. And this is the desire for to extract the thatness out of the whatness because the whatness, like you're just not quite sure what the hell it is. You know, you know it's something. Like Bob Dylan say, you know it's something, but it's blowing in the wind. So in some sense, you want to know, oh, that's what it is. And I think and I think that fusion came along with Christianity, which is kind of started sort of like a mystery religion. You want to objectify it to what it is. And that the fusion between Christianity, early Christianity at least, and to a certain degree Greek thinking, and then the Roman thing that's about power. Because Rome, if anything, was into building roads, into building the forum, just like magnificent. So anybody that comes to Rome, their eye just drop out of the eye socket because like, wow, the spectacle, like these are powerful people, like better not screw around with these guys because they'll just steamroller over you. The power is the thing. And so the fusion between the whatness and this objectification of the whatness into the power of objectifying the material world, in some sense, I think was a very, very interesting, important fusion because, you know, ideas in itself are no good, particularly when they're unstable. But we could build, aqueduct, we could build roads, we could build swords and all that. We could just take over, just like anybody trying to pick up a nickel, you just steamroll over them. They're going to be afraid to pick up the nickel. Like that's a stupid thing to do. So I was arguing, when we came to the word ratio was not a Greek word. And I was objecting to that because, it should be something like phusis. But ratio, in some sense, is a kind of logic, but a logic that is concretized. In other words, ideas solid. So it's almost like building, a monument. This is what ratio is. And I think that began to harden logic to a degree that it is an icon. I mean, it's like so in some sense, I remember somebody from one of the Greek meetings says, like and it started with Plato, is like the problem is that this kind of idealization of the forms is a kind of idolatry because it became such a structure that all the Roman had to do is like build a city around it, build a row around it, and you got it. And it's like what that does is eliminate the process, particularly the process of thinking, because thinking needs to understand that the world out there is always in a process of changing to a certain degree, sometimes fast, sometimes slow. But if you freeze it into thatness, don't worry about it. It'll be that way forever. That's what it is. So I think that concretization, objectification of the thatness from the whatness, you begin to lose the whatness. I mean, what could possibly go wrong? I mean, somebody's going to invade room? Come on. You're kidding me. So in some sense, I think that relationship, I think the concretization of ideas, not just ideas, Plato's not quite as extreme that there are forms, but the forms are incomplete and they could evolve. But when you concretize it, then in a sense you have an absolute logic. And I think that's what the late uh what is it? Logical positive. This it's really built a wall of ideas in which there are no longer any fluidity. So I think when quantum physics came about, it really threw a monkey wrench into the whole thing. So I think the ratio, not logic itself, because logic could transform itself, but ratio, that's it. We've solved it. 2 + 2 is 4. I mean, it's like, go ahead and argue with me about that.
Thanks, Phil. Excellent point. I mean, very logical, very rational, i.e., very practical. It gives you a simple answer. We are fond of a mathematics that gives us a clear answer. We're not so fond of a mathematics that says now you must question the basis of mathematics and your entire perspective. We're like, no, no, I want simple answers that give me easy. So, a number of people have remarked on, one of the defining moments of the Roman epoch is when Marcus Aurelius has his thugs murder Cicero. And he does it because he doesn't like the things that Cicero's been eloquently saying in his speeches against Mark Antony.
That was Mark Antony.
Well, Mark Antony. Sorry, I meant Mark Antony. You're right. Yeah, then Mark Antony sends his thugs to kill Cicero, and Mark Antony doesn't like the speeches that Cicero's been giving because they're too eloquent, they're too powerful, they're too effective. He's like, well, I have to silence that voice. The important thing is how to win, and to win, I need to remove opposition, and he's opposition, so I'm just going to erase him because he is of no importance except as either an aid to my increase of power or an obstacle to my increase in power. And he has no other enduring value of any kind to Mark Antony, right? So he has him murdered. And the thing about it is, in hindsight, that helped to bring about the end of the golden age of Latin literature. First of all, Cicero was in the process of upgrading the Latin language. He was importing terms from Greek, but also in a very careful way, sort of meshing them into the Latin language where necessary. And he was figuring out where did you not have to do that? Where was there a valid Latin term whose definition could be upgraded to encompass the Greek terms, missing content? So he was expanding the capacity for expressiveness, and he was expanding the capacity for how do you wield that language to communicate and to understand the world. But after Cicero's murder, everybody began to back off, right? First of all, they lost the courage to give these really brilliant, eloquent speeches, and Roman oratory became a lost art. People backed off from it. They started shifting to entertainment. Here, sire, let me tell you a fun story. Please don't murder me. Or they would write about things that they were pretty sure they wouldn't get murdered for, like clothing or food or, things. They started to write about peripheral issues and avoid the big, hairy central issues, like what does it mean to have virtue, and who among us behaves in an unvirtuous fashion? All those sort of core issues they wanted to back off from because it became impractical to their survival to talk about these issues that were core to the vitality of the Roman Empire. And the Greeks separate classical Latin into the golden era, which culminates in Cicero, and then the silver era that follows, which is still classical Latin. They've got the grammar, they've got the vocabulary and the pronunciation, but now they've lacked the courage, and they're starting to be more concerned with the form and not the substance. And the heart goes out of the literature. It begins to decay from there. And that was all because of practicality, right? Because Mark Antony was a practical man, right? He wanted what he wanted. Things only meant what they meant to him at the moment, and nothing else existed. This is the heart pragmatism, is the erasure of most of reality and its replacement with this kind of shallow perception of things, a misperception of things, that at least gives you solid, simple answers you can act on, action-oriented thinking, not thinking that would help you to understand if maybe you were taking the wrong actions. So in this way, you can see that from the ancient Greek perspective, there was an increasingly dwindling number of Romans who could be classified as mature adult human beings, because they weren't questioning their own character anymore, and they weren't questioning the character of their empire anymore, because both of those things were too scary. They could get you killed dead, man. Nobody wants that. So they retreated into Dulic and Banausic, imitations of real literature, real philosophy, real thinking. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
It was, this is a process I noticed became particularly strong in the latter part of that sort of Greco-Roman rise to power. It's something you see a century prior, particularly in the 2nd century BC. Now, I referred to Ptolemy the Fat, the Greco-Egyptian pharaoh, who was unpopular. Now, he was living at the a penultimate period of the Great Library. The Great Library had been built as an institution and had been working sort of strongly for about a century, building itself up as this vast institution. And of course, we know of the Great Library, and people get the idea that the Great Library was destroyed at the end of the Roman Empire. The damage started early when suddenly Greco-Roman dictators discovered the wise guys can be trouble. And when Ptolemy the Fat got back into power, I bet they weren't expecting that. They got rid of him. They jumped on his memory, and then he was back. He went to town on the Great Library. The head of the Great Library ended up dying in exile 3 years later, maybe of a broken heart or malnutrition or something like that. Now, and what you're saying about Mark Antony is, just a continuation of this. These wise guys, they're troublemakers. They're getting in our way, let's get rid of them. But might be worth considering maybe they were troublemakers as well as worthwhile individuals, as well as doing good stuff. Maybe they were doing bad stuff in a way as well. So we can't say the authorities like Mark Antony were necessarily completely wrong. I'm not sure on that. But this is a period which is ignored, which was the breakdown of the classical, the earlier type of classical society, which had been relatively free thinking and very inventive. But when we reach empire in the 2nd century, the inheritors of Alexander's empire had become very dictatorial. The Romans, once a free republic, was becoming very dictatorial. We see extremes, the destruction of Carthage. An earlier Roman would have thought, well, why did you go and do something like that? The older Senate members were asking, why did you have Hannibal murdered? He was harmless. What's the point? He's a has-been. He troubled us years ago. He's not troubling us anymore. But the younger senators wanted him dead. This is a weird sort of thing I discovered in the 2nd century. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, it reminds one of Thucydides' bafflement at the transformation of the character of Athens from a century before to the way that it was during the Peloponnesian War. He says their character is rotted out, and you can see it in their behavior. But the question is, when did that happen? Why did that happen? How did that happen? It was about a month ago that we talked about Penia and Plotos. We said the Greeks saw the daimones of Penia, meaning grinding poverty that's so bad that you don't have any freedom to develop your character and you're just always reacting to how do I survive one more day, versus Plautos, where you have so much mountains of wealth that you're disconnected from reality and your character starts to rot from the disconnection. And they talked about how Penia and Plautos they saw as the xuntukoi, the conditions of contingency, going back to Joe's agency and contingency, the conditions of contingency that could create the greatest damage to human character and set people up for tragedy. You know, the Greeks were not in any way opposed to poverty and riches. I mean, at all. They like diversity, right? But grinding poverty and extreme wealth they saw as utterly destructive of character, and they show that in sort of tragedy after tragedy. So you wonder, you know, to what extent was the problem with Athens that there's the rivers of money pouring in through the Delian League, so that you know they got disconnected from reality, and to what extent was Rome's military victories led to too much money pouring into Rome, so they recreated the same conditions the Athenians had at the point when they went nuts and started the Peloponnesian War. I remember that in the era you're talking about, there were lots of debates among the Romans about what is the nature of Roman virtue, what does it mean to be a Roman man, and to what extent were the old, hard, sound Roman virtues being eroded by this new era of luxury and license, in which people just they had increasing amounts of power but decreasing amounts of personal character. They didn't know how to deal with the temptations and opportunities presented to them, and we're doing the sort of things that you're talking about. And it's very in keeping with the ancient worldview that this is their concern. Their concern is that impulse of self-direction. Is it in a healthy direction or not a healthy direction? It doesn't matter what else you have. If your character is pointing you in an unhealthy direction, you might as well not have those things. And indeed, if the people who have those problems in their self-direction are in positions of power within society, then it's not just they who are sick, because as the directors of society, they make society sick by dragging it with their power in the unhealthy direction of their unhealthy characters. So these are all issues that the Romans. So I'm glad you brought this stuff up. And these are all classical concerns. Joe, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah. I just want to maybe just clarify really quickly, this self-direction, to make sure I understand it properly, because I think that this is an important point. I mean, for me, so I'm going to pull it back into a little bit of a different direction. One thing I was that resonated with me was that you said, that how easily we can be made to want things that are, or be motivated to do things that are not necessarily in our best interests. And so, and thinking about that in terms of self-direction. And one of the things that I've always actually recognized is that how easily I worked at a couple bigger firms that had, brand names, if you will. And how many people would drink the Kool-Aid, right? And just buy into, this is great for us. And then, they were basically like working more hours and doing things that they would never otherwise do. And then, eventually they would become maybe a director or something and actually make the entire company sick, or firm sick. So very much just like you said. And so it really is something where we can actually be made to kind of buy into something something that really isn't, in our best interest. And I kind of am struggling a little bit distinguishing that individual, the self-directed individual, if you will, from the self-governing individual. Because a self-governing individual, I look as somebody that is, has they're living according to principles. And so they're falling back on something that, and it, you hope it's for the character, that they're falling back on, but at the very least, they're a little bit more cognizant as to why they're doing something. Whereas the self-directed individual, and I just want to make sure I was this clear, or self, motivated, however you want to put it, is somebody that is more easily programmed into thinking that something is good for them that really isn't. And it's an important, the reason why if you break down what the idea of wisdom, and if you were to, look at it as, information, knowledge, and wisdom, and you can go even a layer lower and say data. I almost look at the information level as somebody that can execute, I'm sorry, the knowledge level is somebody that can execute very effectively. They understand how to do something, but they don't necessarily understand why they're doing it. And so that they're missing that component, so to speak. And that's kind of where I'm seeing this self-directed individual, where the self-governing individual is somebody that kind of has a better understanding as to why they're doing something in the first place, and is not necessarily as easily programmed. So it's like an important distinction to really kind of make, because when you're talking about this wisdom, Sofrosune, when you're making that distinction, I'm just trying to make sure, because even the wording itself, where he's talking about how the Greeks, conceived of some of us being self-governing for better or worse, but then he talks about, like every natural being, we have the impulse, and he's going into a different idea as to, talking about our motivations, so to speak. So one is like, a little bit more contemplative. And I'm trying to just make this distinguishing this, because whenever even attacking a problem, there are individuals that can do it very effectively, and to ask them. I mean, sometimes, but you ask them why they do it, forget it. And so
because it's because it's true, because it's the right thing to
exactly.
do.
Exactly.
To make a little circle.
Exactly. It's
right because it's right.
And they can even. It was really quickly one place that I was working. They're like, oh, they had dry cleaning. They started doing things to make sure you'd stay at work later, and they're like, oh, this is great. I'm like, are you out of your mind? It's like, because you know what they're doing, like they're just basically making you live here, and so that anyway. That's a whole another side note.
Yeah, Microsoft did that for a while. It's like, make it so easy not to go home,
Yeah.
but then everybody burns out faster. It's like
Exactly,
right, because they're living an unbalanced life.
Because they're doing what's it's because they're motivated now.
They're motivated,
like,
right?
oh, well.
Yeah, they've been reprogrammed, and they don't understand what just happened to them. Yeah, no, these are great distinctions, Joe. And I on behalf of Aristotle and Heraclitus, well done. That they would want you to make these distinctions, right? This is what they cared about. These are the exact distinctions they cared about, and it would frustrate them how little of the modern world makes these distinctions at all. Is even aware of these issues, that they are issues. They were, to the ancient Greeks, these were the very most important issues there were. These were the basis for the survival of society or our species. And, in the modern world, these are mostly non-issues that we're completely oblivious to. We lack the language to make the distinctions. We lack the awareness. We don't think about these things. We don't talk about these things. I go back over and over to the Constitution of the United States and the requirements for being president. right? American citizen of a certain age, not yet convicted of treason. That's it. You don't have to have any of these other features. You don't have to have sopra sune. You don't have to believe other people should survive. I mean, it's all this stuff is missing because and that's typical of the modern age. That to the modern age, right, this entire realm of issues that were the central concerns of classical governance not only aren't as important, they aren't important at all because they don't exist at all. We can't even clearly say what it is that we do when we ignore these issues because we don't have words for these things. We don't even make these distinctions. And to Aristotle, that is as weird as not distinguishing between food and poison. It's like, right, it's like we have a word that stands for both of them, and we refuse to make separate words to distinguish the two. It's like, why would you distinguish them? So what if one kills you? Big deal. You buy it, you put it in your mouth, you swallow it. That's what it is. It's not the only thing that's important. I'm a pragmatic man. I just want to know if I can put it in my mouth.
It's a very practical approach, and it lacks any kind of curiosity.
Yeah.
I mean, so what happens is when you lack the curiosity, then you no longer question things. So you're just wondering how quickly you can get it done.
Yeah, the only curiosity is, how quickly can I make some money from this?
Yeah, exactly.
Deal, right? I gotta make some money here.
That's exactly right. You're no longer worried about value. You're actually just worried about what's in that moment, which is, the instantaneous pleasure of making a deal, so to speak, that maybe has no necessarily intrinsic value. So, so something there is, that's it's something that is just made up.
Yes. Thank you, Joe.
Yeah.
Thanks for highlighting that. I'm going to call on Stephen, and then I'm going to turn us to the next few sentences, which take us into someplace really interesting that I didn't understand until a month ago. So, Stephen, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Good news is it's going to be very short. That'll make you happy. He's making this point here. Again, it's an age of transition. No Greek god ever told a Greek, "Thou shalt." Now we've got this new god coming in, who's the dictator. I've dictated. Now I'm not using dictator as a pejorative. A dictator is just a certain type of institution. Could be bad, can be good sometimes. And so they've gone from the Greek gods, who didn't say "thou shalt," to the 10 Commandments, "thou shalt." So this seems to be the transitional claim of this particular paragraph. I just thought, sort of remind people. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Stephen. You're setting up perfectly what we're talking about. That was right on point. Yes, this is what's so interesting about sentence 4. It's part of why it's so complex. We've spent all this time leading up to it and talking about the way that it's talking about this complex classical appreciation for the role of character and self-direction in all living things generally, but also in us specifically, and how different we are from the rest of them, while at the same time being the same as the rest of them. This is the you're getting into Greek philosophy when you've got paradoxes. So the paradox is that we have an impulse of self-direction that is very quintessence of our nature, makes us like every natural being. But the specific quality of that impulse is the opposite of every other creature. Because every other creature, it's pointing more or less unerringly through sopra sune in the direction of health and vitality. Whereas in us, that's the one thing it never points at. It points at what we're enthusiastic about, whether that's good for us or bad for us. We don't make that distinction. We don't have that compass. We can't tell when we're pointed at it or when we're pointed away from it. It's even more opposite than the opposite, because if we unerringly pointed away from sopra sune, we could learn that about ourselves and then correct and just do the opposite of whatever came naturally to us, and we'd have found sopra sune. But it's worse than that. You could be pointing at anything. You can neither trust it nor can you trust the opposite of it. It's erratic what we point at. So on the one hand, there's all this complexity, and you could write a whole book just about this set of ideas, just to capture this set of classical ideas and contrast them with how we think of people in the modern world. You could write a whole book about that. But then we get to the second half, And the second half of sentence 4 is what flows through into all the next paragraphs to come. And that's what sets up the really interesting thing that I found a month ago. He says that they have that impulse of self-direction, and which not even the gods in their authority deem it right to overwhelm or violate. As Nietzsche perspicuously remarked, no Greek god ever told a Greek, thou shalt. This is that thing that moderns can't understand about the Greek religion. It did not have commandments. They did not give commands. In fact, having come out of 1,000 years of medievalism, we can't conceive of any religion, not just the Greek religion. We can't conceive of any religion as being different from the Christian religion in this quality. We assume that commandments are everywhere, and all the gods are that's what a god is. A god commands you what to do, and you follow it or you don't follow it. The whole idea that that is a weird, specific kind of religion, and that most religions never worked that way, that's unthinkable to us. We can't conceive of it. That our whole concept of what is a god and so forth is all utterly grounded in this, as I think Stephen put it well, this kind of dictatorial, the deity dictates and then our job is to follow, or else, or we get punished. But the Greeks didn't, that wasn't how Greek polytheism worked. The Greeks didn't do things that way. And so where this is leading is to somewhere really interesting. He says, those gods have not a paternal, but an avuncular relation to men, offering counsel to those who can benefit from it. And then comes the twist. And this is where we left off last week. This is the thing. We didn't do the setup right to be able to move on to the next part. This week we can go to the next part. He says, or the gods manipulate the many blind spots in motivation and judgment, to which hubristic or overreaching humans are obtusely liable. The gods manipulate they manipulate our blind spots against us to set up tragedies. That is to say, those bad things didn't happen to Oedipus because the gods dictated the ending. All the gods did was let Oedipus act according to his deformed character. And when he did so, it produced deformed results. This is what modern readers of Oedipus Tyrannus utterly miss, right? Because we're so used to those stories of gods being mean to mortals. Somebody must have been, and use Stephen's earlier terminology, somebody must have been making a victim out of Oedipus. It's just oppressing him and cruelly punishing him. And that's how I used to read the Greek myths when I was a kid. I loved them, but I hated that Athena turned Arachne into a spider. Why? That was so cruel? Why did she do that? I saw all these instances of cruelty, and that's how the translators and storytellers in the modern world tell these myths. Those mean gods did mean things to these poor people. Sometimes the people were mean and somebody, maybe should have punished them. But sometimes they did what they did didn't seem like such a big deal. And then the gods were mean to them because they're just big meanies. And every time that we read it that way, and every time the translators write it that way, they're failing to convey the authentic classical Greek religion. They are instead conveying a modern post-medieval dictatorial version, a caricature of that religion. And not the kind of caricature that shows the inner character, but the kind of caricature where you impose a complete distortion, like a funhouse mirror. And now the thing looks like something that it really wasn't. So, but what the gods do is they punish the powerful and the overreaching through the character of the person who is powerful and overreaching. Their own character is used against them. This idea that character, not Zeus is the god of lightning bolts and Poseidon is the god of the sea, but character, human character, as the centerpiece of the religion. That this is what distinguishes the Olympian religion from the old Titanic religion that preceded it. In the Titan religion, they really were about the natural forces and just brute force and power. But in the Olympian religion, it's specifically about human character and how it works and its relationship to the gods. And this is something we always miss when we study this stuff, and we are not expecting to find it, and we don't understand these issues ourselves. We certainly can't translate them authentically because we don't know what we're talking about. He says, the gods do not directly contravene the sovereignty of human self-authority or autarkia. Now, I'm going to hold off on paragraphs 9 and 11, but I want to focus on this thing, this idea. And what I want to do is point people to, there's an essay on academia.edu. You can download the essay for free if you navigate the links carefully. Don't click on the one that says, oh, do you want to pay a whole bunch of money for the complete PDF? No, I just want the free PDF. I'm fine with the free PDF. Go ahead and download it. You can even read it online. And what she does here is she looks at Plutarch's essay on the epsilon on the Temple of Delphi. Because there has been a big, we all talk about Gnothi and some of us talk about Medenagan, and a few people talk about the one that's a surety or guarantee and then failure. But hardly anyone talks about the most prominent of all of the engravings on the Temple of Delphi, which is a great big letter epsilon, centered right up, as you look at the from the front, and here's the pillar, here's the stairs, here's the pillars, here's the triangular pronaeum at the top. It's carved right there into the center where anybody can look at it. Front, center, and top is this big single letter, the epsilon. Why is it bigger than all of the other carvings? Bigger than Gnothi and bigger than the rest of them. And why is it a single letter? I mean, we know that they loved to be as terse and concise as possible, but surely this is overkill. How are we supposed to know what this letter means? Well, Plutarch wrote a whole essay about what it means, or what he thinks it means. And he agreed that he's only sharing part of what it means, and the rest of it he's holding back to people who've been initiated into the mystery religion, which is awkward for us since we can't be initiated into the mystery religion today, which means we don't get to find out the end of the story. We only get the first part. The part that's in this essay, that I'd read this essay before years ago, the part that jumped out at me this time is where she says, okay, that's what's on the front. Everybody talks about what's on the front of the Temple of Apollo at the Oracle of Delphi. But moderns don't talk about what's on the sides. Whereas the ancients used to talk about what's on the sides all the time because it's incredibly important. On one side of the Temple of Delphi, I can't remember if it's west or east, but one or the other, is a great relief of Apollo, god of Delphi, right? The god of enlightenment, right? The sun god. By the time you get to the late religion, although the early religion, he was not a sun god, he was a god of light, of enlightenment, and he's depicted as he always is, as the eternal youth, offering wisdom. The other side, I can't remember whether it's the east or west, is Dionysus. And they talk about how Dionysus, unlike Apollo, Dionysus is not always depicted in a single form. He's depicted in many forms, as a baby, as an adolescent, as an adult, as an old man. He's depicted dancing, singing, all kinds of countless different ways is Dionysus. And Dionysus is not the god of getting drunk. Dionysus is the god of, well, what exactly? What's he doing isn't this the Temple of Apollo? Why is Dionysus occupying equally prominent position as Apollo, carved directly onto Delphi, the temple supposedly of Apollo? And the answer is that the ancients didn't think it was the temple of Apollo. They just said that as a shorthand. It was the temple of Apollo and Dionysus, both at the same time in relation to each other. That's why they're carved right on there in equivalent locations. And what we know about Dionysus is that he's the inventor of tragedy, of theater as a way to expose character. That the purpose of the Greek plays, the tragedies, was to put characters under pressure, to compel them to reveal what their character actually is. So at first you get to see the person's mask, their persona, their brand, if you will, who they want to believe they are, or who they want you to believe they are. But it's only in crisis, under pressure, that the mask falls and you find out who they actually are. You see the inner nature of the person, which might even have been unconscious to them. But whether it was conscious or unconscious to them, at a minimum, it's hidden, it's cryptic. It's not like enlightenment. It's not like logic and reason and writing. It's not on the surface where anybody can look at it. It's a hidden harmony down inside that has to be struggled to be found. And what you see in this essay, they talk about the enormous prominence that this concept had, not just to the ancient Greeks, but to the Romans who respected this religion. And in it, they talk about the idea that the Greeks saw Apollo and Dionysus as the same god. It's two faces of the same god. And it's because it's two faces of the human mind. Human wisdom needs its noesis, but it also needs its gnosis. It needs both of them, and they exist side by side on the walls of the oracle at Delphi, which is where people go for wisdom. If you want wisdom, you need both of these things. And both of them are children of Zeus. Apollo and Dionysus are sons of Zeus. So all of this has to do with the stuff that we talked about last year about Zeus as a tempter, as a third power who works on people's character, who exposes people's character. So that people of good character, they'll have opportunities open up for them. And people of bad character, no matter how much power they may wield, will be defeated not because some external god hurt them, but because their own character hurt them. The consequences of their actions hurts them because of their inner nature. Zeus is the head of the pantheon because he's the one who understands this better than anyone, and his sons exemplify it in their role at Delphi. So this is all really interesting stuff. I mean, it shows a level of sophistication in the appreciation of human character, human intelligence, and so forth that you just don't find anywhere in the modern world. Our ideas about human intelligence and character are, well, we barely believe character is a real thing. If we believe, it's like it's all to them it was the most important thing and to us it's we think it's like some kind of brand. Oh, I have character. I have a good character. I want people to think that about me because then they'll like me and I'll make money. That we have this really shallow concept of character. We certainly couldn't imagine it being the centerpiece of an entire religion the way that it was for the ancient Greeks. So this is the stuff he's talking about. This idea that the Greek gods saw human character as the sacred part of us, because it's the nature within us. It's the part within us that's infinite. That transcends the mortal. And as such, it has to be handled carefully with respect for that autarkia, that self-authority. That's the centerpiece of our nature. This is what he's talking about in sentences 4 through 8. So Phil, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
A couple of things. I first want to ask. I'm surprised, and it's helpful for me to understand that Dionysus and Apollo were the two faces of the same person, the same god, I should say it that way. And so that's very enlightening. That's very interesting. It really shines a light on Greek religion. That's kind of interesting. It's not a singularity. The first question I want to ask, based on what you said, is that Heraclitus left his documents at the temple of Artemis. So where does Artemis stand? Is she the human manifestation of the two faces of God? Is that what that is? I mean, that's why she's both a god and a muse, because the muse gives you the hint of what you should do. And that actually leads to my second question, which is before you set Dionysus and Apollo with the same person. Could somebody tell me which god would it be? I have 3 words. It seems to me the word is like you shall, you should, and you will. Those are 3 very different words that
Yes.
indicates the thing that you will be doing.
Yeah.
You shall seems like a kind of command. It may be a soft command, but it may be a hard command, but it is a command of sort, I have the power. You better do it. You shall. You will means that he's letting you do whatever the hell you want, but you're going to end up doing what will happen. You should means it's whispering in your ear, hey, don't do that. You shouldn't do that. it's allowing you to think about it and balance the thing between what would happen and what you think would happen. Because the
Yes.
Greeks believe in fate,
Yes.
okay? So your will is connected to fate. And he's warning you, if you don't do it, fate will take over your spirit and you will end up doing it nevertheless. So which God or who was, there's some men that kind of whisper into
Yes.
Oedipus's ear. Unfortunately, he's a blind man. Don't do this. Right? So it wasn't a God. So, oh, he's just a stupid blind guy, not a
Yes.
God. So if somebody had whispered in Oedipus's ear, I, you should you shouldn't do this, or you should do something else, then it would be a hint, but it would let the individual make the choice and think about it. Yeah, maybe I shouldn't, you know, but
Yes.
because you're telling yourself, not God, you should.
Yes.
Maybe I shouldn't. So it seems like those are three very different words that address the same problem. And when you take fate into it, then should has a more meaningful meaning than just, oh, I'll take my chances. Right?
Yes.
Because we think of should as something related to the possibility or the probability, actually, it's the right word, the probability it will go against me. It's kind of 50-50, you see
Yeah.
what I'm saying? And
Yeah.
so I think what God, if any, actually whisper in your ear, you should rather
Yeah.
than shall.
Yes.
That would be a loving God of human beings.
Thank you, Phil. These are great questions. And of course, the latter set of questions is complicated by the fact that modern English has lost some of the nuances between shall and should and will. Um, I always find it interesting to go back to the earlier definitions of those things. So to will is that it is your intent, it is your will to do this thing, but it doesn't mean it's going to happen. I'm go back to what Joe was talking about, agency versus contingency. It means this is the agency I'm bringing to the picture. When you say I will work in the garden today, that doesn't mean you're going to. That means that your agency is pointing you in that direction. Your self-direction is heading that way, but God knows what contingency has in store for you. Right? They're going to collide, and if they collide the right way, then it actually happens. But if they collide the wrong way, then it doesn't actually happen. So the distinction between will and shall used to be that will is what you intend, and shall is what's going to happen regardless of my intentions. It might be that I don't want to do that at all, but I shall. That's I'm under the circumstances I'm in. Maybe you're commanding me and I have to do it. Right. So the shall has the shadow of a command on it, but it's not the command itself. And it might not be a shall because of a command. It might just be that, I will go into the garden and work, but because my legs got broken, I shall sit here and read this book instead. These are the way that English used to work. And would was even more interesting because the way would is used now is pretty much as a subjunctive. Under these circumstances, I would do this. But the old definition used to be found in the phrase, would that there were peace on earth. I would have liked the following things, but I will do this, except that unfortunately something intervenes, so I shall just sit here. So English used to be good at making these distinctions. In Shakespeare's time, these distinctions were part of the definitions. Now we're not sure what we mean when we say anything. So,
Well,
God knows.
I'll accept them sitting reading a book as long as the book on gardening.
Yes. Yes. Well, that's my compromise. I'll read a book on gardening. That's how it'll go. So those are great. Let me talk about Artemis just for a sec. So Artemis has always been a mystery, partly because what are her domains include, on the one hand, hunting, and on the other hand, wild creatures, and by extension, the wilderness, but also pregnant women and babies. And how the hell do these things relate to each other? And so she was usually presented as an amalgamation, and these are her things. And that's just memorize it. That's just how it is. Shut up. Don't try to understand it any deeper than that. This is just what it is. And then, the moon sometimes too. We chuck because we'd mix her with Selene. And in this combination, partly we're seeing the syncretism of Greek polytheism where multiple deities have been merged, but partly we're seeing the result of the Greco-Roman merge that the Roman Empire did, where they absconded with the Greek deities and claimed that the Roman deities were the same as the Greek, which they weren't. Right? I mean, the Roman deities were about sometimes slightly different things and sometimes very different things. And by the time a Greek goddess had been Romanized, she might be nearly unrecognizable compared to what she had been before when she was authentically Greek. So a great deal of what we think we know about Artemis is actually what we know about Diana, or Diana, I guess she would be the Roman goddess. So you may recall it was a year or two ago that I did the deep dive on Artemis to try to sort out the answer to that question you asked. Why would Heraclitus deposit his cherished scroll at the Temple of Artemis and not, say, at Delphi, which would seem like the obvious place? And was it just convenience? Was he just lazy? It's like, well, no, I mean, because what these things have in common that are Artemis's actual domains is sophrosune, that concept that moderns don't understand at all and can't recognize when they're looking right at it, on the one hand, and aristeia, the pursuit of excellence, the pursuit of self-mastery and overcoming, on the other. So endlessly chasing sophrosune is the role in society of the Aristos, right? That you should always be trying to improve your attachment to sophrosune, to which we have no guaranteed attachment, but without which everything fails, right? It's the ultimate virtue to the Greeks. So when you put that together and look at and read between the lines, it seems clear that Artemis was held in such enormous esteem because nature naturally has sophrosune. All the creatures and plants in it have sophrosune. We're the only ones that don't. And if we want sophrosune, we have to study nature. We have to pursue nature and pursue the changes to our character required to try to develop an ersatz quasi-sophrosune within ourselves so that we don't doom ourselves. Thus, character's fate, right?
So your explanation leads me to think I was at least somewhat correct that she's kind of like a human being that is, that is a god but a human being. That
Yeah.
sounds a lot like Jesus. I mean,
You'll find a lot of these people in Greek religion. They're sort of in between.
I know. So that's interesting because I know that she was a muse for the arts, and so
Yeah.
so that seems like as much of a human activity as anything, finding harmony in the structure.
Aristeia and sophrosune. I think that's her core.
Yeah.
And we describe her the way we do because both of those things are invisible to us, and so we can't explain. We just have to list the bits that result from it and cross our fingers that we're in the ballpark. Anyway, great questions, Phil. Thank you. Donald, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
It's sort of nitpicky shit. The Greek gods were thus at one and the same time. No, that's the wrong. But the gods do not directly contravene the sovereignty. In this clause here, I read it sometimes and I think Kenneth made a mistake, and other times I think he didn't. The sovereignty of human self-authority or autarkia. And I think those are two different things. It could be, because self-authority in Greek is autarkia, but with a chi, not a k. So he's done that because autarkia with the k is self-sufficiency. Or, so, it's like I saw the other day a really good explanation about why Hungary causes so much problems in the EU. And it was because 80% of their fossil fuel, or 80% of their energy is fossil fuels from Russia. The other 20% is electricity from a nuclear power plant, which is totally maintained and serviced by Russian technicians. Therefore, Hungary has no self-sufficiency in energy. And so it has no self-governance, self-authority in deciding its policies. Because the lights go out. Literally, an entire country's lights go out if they don't take the cause they're doing. And that's why I read this sentence. One way I look at sovereignty of human self-authority or autarkia, like he's just clarifying that self-authority is autarkia in Greek, or it's two separate things. The sovereignty of human self-governance or autarkia, I don't know, or the sovereignty of human autarkia. It's like those words, there is no well, maybe to a really stubborn Greek, there's self-governance without self-sufficiency, but then that probably means death. It would mean somebody, you'd have to say there are people who are willing to face death, but normally in this thing, and I just look at it and I say, oh, what is Kenneth? I know what he's saying, but it just looks like, gosh, is somebody who doesn't know any Greek going to look at that and say, oh, he's just explaining to me that autarkia means self-authority in Greece by putting that or instead of like a comma or parenthetical or something? Or is he pointing to really these two concepts are so closely tied that you seldom have one without the other. In fact, you may not be able to have one without the other. Human sovereignty consists of both self-sufficiency and self-rule. Okay, enough pedantry. I used to talk to Kenneth about he wanted analysis, analusis in Greek to be equivalent to reductionism in modern thought, that it's reduction. But ana means up. It can't be that. And he would always say analysis, and then he would do this breaking down into constituent parts.
Yes.
And I would say, it can't be that. Whatever you think it is, it can't be that. I know what you're trying to say, but it's not that word.
Yes.
Analusis means to loosen up, to let you see constituent parts of a greater whole by spreading them out or loosening them up. It doesn't mean so whatever they were thinking wasn't really reductionism. And it's I've there's just a few words like this that I just, where are you going, Kenneth? Where are you going?
Yes.
Not that I actually argue with Kenneth. I defer to Kenneth in all things.
But since he's not on this call, we can
Yeah, since he's not on this call, I'll make my uneasiness there,
Yes.
but I just kind of think he's got half English, half Greek. He could have said self-authority and self-sufficiency, or he could have said autarkia and autarkia.
Yes. Yes.
And I would have said, oh, that's wonderful.
But instead he chose this.
But instead he chose this. Was it to like, I'm just gonna derail some, picky little brain somewhere, and they're going to have to think about this sentence for a while.
I think he set this trap for you specifically, Donald.
It would not be the only time. But
I think you're right on about this. I think you're right on.
I just, since you're assembling this in a book,
yeah,
and you're going to have editorial, you're going to have
footnotes
and stuff like that. You could just.
This is going to get footnoted for sure, and I think
we've saw this in some of the other stuff where he plays with these two words.
He likes to do this. He likes to.
He likes to, and when you get two words that are almost cognates, in Greek and English, and then he mixes them. He's just like,
he's having a good time.
Okay, reader, wake up. Are you paying attention, or are you just going to run over this pothole or bump in the road, speed bump, and ignore it?
Yes.
Enough. That's enough.
It's good though. I mean, my guess is that this whole paragraph is full of these. I'm not going to say equivocation, although that's the nearby word. He's playing with words and related concepts throughout all of these sentences in this paragraph, like the way that it opens. He's juxtaposing things that affect each other and are deeply intertwined, but presenting them as two separate clauses of the same sentence. And he's doing that on purpose.
Well, I always like earlier in the paragraph, I kind of got a snicker when we're he's all about existentialism.
Yes.
And then he talks about the quintessence. I always like it when existentialists talk about essence.
Yes.
But that does distinguish his existentialism in that through knowing ourselves, we find an essence.
Yes.
Instead of the essence being plopped out there first, and then we have to somehow conform to it. Well, we end up needing to conform to it in order to perfect ourselves to become, let's just don't start some conversation that's not here. But
it is though. That's what he's doing. He's alluding to so many things in rapid succession and pulling them together into this mosaic. He is fully intending to have us play with this. I mean, there's just no doubt. He was in a playful mood when he wrote this. There's times when Kenneth can be a pedant, and there's times when he's screwing around. Like in some of his casual emails. And then there's times like this where he's doing both at the same time. He's not being as pedantic as he could, and he's alluding to a lot of things, but leaving it to us to finish the picture. And if he didn't want us to finish the picture, he would have nailed it down more like he does in some other places.
Well, I think it would be very interesting to go back to the Comics Journal and see what the letters to the editor the following the following issue were like about these things.
Whine. So much whining.
Oh,
Why do you even publish this guy? It's just word salad. He's just trying to make himself sound smart. I mean, right? I mean, that accounts for 90% of the
yeah, but yeah, they would just, they would, I don't, the arguments there. All I can say is I don't remember laughing as hard as reading the comments. And then when Kenneth would choose to reply to a comment, it would just be.
But that was always great. Oh man, yeah. And Fiore would get into it. Yeah. So, I mean, some of the clues that this is what he's doing here are just what Donald pointed out. Self-authority is the autarkia with the key, and autarkia is the self-sufficiency. And he chooses one in English and one in Greek, but he could have done either set, or he could have done the pair in English with parens in Greek or what have you. But instead, he's chosen to do it the way he has to gesture. He's gesturing. He might as well have named a philosopher here. He's saying you're going to have to think about this. You're going to have to read about this. He's saying I have a direction I'm trying to go and a point I'm trying to make, and I'm moving through the middle of very complex, multidimensional things. And I'm going to give you all the clues you need that there are a lot of dimensions to this thing. And then I'm not going to explore all those dimensions for you right now because I have a different point that I'm trying to make. But I'm going to make it clear that there's a lot more going on. You can see that in sentences 3 and 4, when in quick succession, he says self-cultivation, self-governing, and self-direction. And on the one hand, so he didn't repeat the same word 3 times. But on the other hand, these 3 concepts are very tightly related to each other. And that means, among other things, he's talking about not just the comparison, but the contrast and the whole system of relationships that the Greeks believed existed between self-direction and self-governance and self-cultivation. You can't be an Aristos unless you are cultivating your character. And that's what's required to be self-governing. If you're not doing self-cultivation, you're not self-governing. But all people are self-directing because their character, the nature of the role that character plays within us, it directs our behavior. And he talks about that direction, that big arrow that is, the quintessence, that impulse of self-direction that is the quintessence. So he's basically trying to haul in whole books full of information at a time with each of these words and phrases and have you think through the relationships to see what he's pointing at here. If you see all these relationships between autarkia and autarkia, between self-cultivation, self-governance, self-direction, character, nature, all these things that are different sides of the same multidimensional coin, then it helps to explain why the Greeks, on the one hand, felt that they could govern human affairs strictly through human character, because human character is so woven into, as I can't remember if it was Phil or Donald who said fate. I think it was Phil. That fate is all woven throughout this, but that the Greek concept of fate is not a dictatorial fate, but a character-based fate, in which it is the Greeks, the Sphinx even, can read your character in a way that you can't and see where you're going. To them, or to the Moirai, you're an open book. They just read your character and go, oh, so that's where you're not trying to grow into an oak tree. You're trying to grow into a patch of nettles. That's where but you think you're an oak tree. You think you're going to be a mighty oak, but you're going to be a pestilence on somebody. They can see that just by reading us, right? I mean, that's the Greeks thought that was one of the things that separated the divine from the human, is to what extent are we oblivious to ourselves? We don't know who we are. So he's alluding to all this stuff and saying, so why would the Greeks dictate to people when they which is like pounding you with a hammer? Why would they threaten you with hell or offer you the reward of heaven when they already have your character, which controls you with an infinitely nuanced, subtle complexity that drives the directions you take in your life? Who would want a club when you have an entire rich tool chest full of possibilities that are all within the ethos, within your character. The gods don't govern us by shouting commands and threats like a bully. They govern us through, and now we're back to Stephen. They govern us through that thinnest, most delicate of threads that we can't even perceive, but that is unbreakable, specifically because we can't perceive it. We're so self-blind, we don't even know we have a character, let alone that it's driving us to do one thing and then the next. And thus, we can't break the chains of our character unless we become aware that those chains are there, that we are leashed to our character, that it is setting our direction, that our unconscious mind is deciding what we notice in the room before our conscious mind ever has a chance to start making its rational, willful decisions. Is making rational, willful decisions off of a menu that's already been selected for it without its permission by the unconscious character. It's like those elections where, the people in power don't care which of the two candidates you vote for. Either of them will satisfy the wealthy just fine. You don't really have a choice. It's a choice without a difference that doesn't make a difference here. So this is the level at which the Greek deities are able to govern us. And yet it's not their fault that we have the character we have, because we could always self-cultivate. If we don't like the character we have, we could always develop our character into a better direction if we were willing to work for it. But most of us are too lazy, and so we just go with the character we just ended up with and act it out and don't care about individuating. All of this is tied up in this. And so this is why I think Donald, this is why he's using the language the way he is. So he's saying, yeah, there is a whole lot more to this. I'm going to gesture at this and this and this and this, and they're all out of terms, but I'm just going to go right through the middle of them and point at this one central issue, which is they had this incredibly nuanced perspective on the structure of the human mind and human intelligence. And they saw that through that structure, that was the domain of Zeus. That was how the polytheistic deities governed men. So, Ari, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Hey, everybody. It's so good to see you. I'm going to take the conversation back a little bit. I raised my hand a while ago.
Yeah,
and there's
please.
no problem with waiting. It's just I'm really interested in something Joe said about this dichotomy between self-directedness and there we go. And what's it called? Self-governed.
Mhm.
And it reminds me of something I'm learning from another book, but it's a reference to I got the source here, or maybe I don't. Where's the source? It's good. I had it here. Give me a moment. Oh yeah, about a book called "The Chrysanthemum and the Sword: Patterns of Chinese Culture" by Ruth Benedict, who is an anthropologist, and she was studying essentially Japanese culture to sort of understand, because Americans was in this war with them, and so she was tasked during the war. Once we were in the war, to we're going to go attack them. We got to know our enemy. So she did all this analysis, and afterwards, in 1946, she wrote this book, and it's essentially comparing Western, what she calls guilt cultures, versus at least in this case, Japanese shame cultures. And guilt is obviously a loaded term that has a lot of different meanings, but here it's specifically not like guilty or innocent, but it has to do with more like, I think, self-governance versus self-directed. And a shame culture and an honor culture is one where you're explicitly focused on how other people will perceive you and cultivating essentially a topology, a surface level nature of things, where you have your inner self is often in great contradiction with your external self, and that cognitive dissonance is just a natural part of phenomena. I have an inner heart and an external heart, and I have no problems, showing one or the other, because that's just the necessity of society. But it means our decision making is primarily governed by what the external world around me is, whether I'm going to get honor or shame. And a guilt culture, which is the conjugate of guilt culture, would be she uses the word righteousness, which is also a loaded term, but I translate it much more to a moral culture, or the Kantian style of having a self of integrity. And again, the morality here is not good or bad. A morality is, again, I like the tips from you here. There are a set of tools And you can build certain things with these tools. And in certain circumstances, their morality is very effective and gives you sopersume, so to speak. It very works, but it has its limitations if the circumstances change. For instance, let's say your morality is shipbuilding and you got to go across the sea. Fantastic. But, when you get to, let's say, the other side of the world, you got to land and set up shop, and you're in Jamestown and you don't have anything to combat disease. Your tools are not, your morality is not so effective. But she points out that this is very much an externally natured person versus internally natured person. And each one has their limits. And it almost seems like sopersume is like saying there's a compass within a compass. There's aspects of you need to be governed towards the external about what your circumstances are doing. And you have to also cultivate a very sort of excellent tools that you're going to use. But you can't think that, if you're really focused on hammers, you're just going to get thinking everything's nails, as opposed to like maybe if you've got some saws in there, you can see some wood to cut down, right? So you want to cultivate as many tools you can and learn the difference between you use them. But there's this guidance. She talks about almost in a more overly simplified way that the internal sense of guilt culture is superior to the shame culture. But I think this is again a bit of a mistake. It's more that they each are a part of a complex machine. And so that in like Joe's example of the company where you're going to be self-directed, that makes a lot of sense. And it goes back to Phil's ideas of the whatness for the thatness. It has to do with how what I call the whatness is the territory and the thatness is the map of the territory. So I call mapping the territory. A map is much more effective than just stumbling through the jungle, right? We need a map. So, but having to update the map is also very important. If we just have a fixed map that doesn't leave in a big volcano for whatever, you get the volcano's going to blow you up. So I like that in this idea of the company, part of us is very much directed towards what is the map saying? That's the self-directed person. Very useful, very efficient, great way to just navigate the models that we're building. And then the more inner directed person is updating the models, or maybe not. Maybe it's to some degree they still have a model of how they build their model, but there's an inner sense which I'm using principles, which are more like how these are my teachings that my teacher, my professor taught me about how to make maps, right? And so I don't have to get stuck with the same map, but even still, that is a model that you're stuck with. And to some degree, these are the human limitations. And that takes me to the final point, which gets me to the text. Sorry if I've been too long. I have a lot of things on my mind, but I'm trying to keep it concise and clear. Is in the text, and this is I don't know if I'm purposely or having fun with you, Rick, where I'm going to be straw manning you a little bit on purpose to point out something. But really, I would like to say the other nicer way, less playful, but more just genuine, is that I think I'm going to be adding to something you were saying or expand on something you're saying, not really contradicting you, but the fun guy in me wants to pretend I'm contradicting you. That you were pointing out this. Let's go to the text of that the gods, the Greek gods or the ancient gods, I'm finding a specific spot. Here we go. That they're the avuncular, and that they manipulate the blind spots of people. And this made me think when you were describing it, that just let's assume as a blind man. I'm going to use this metaphor. They just let him stumble right into the cliff and fall off the cliff, right? Or smack right into the wall. But I also feel like when it says manipulate here, they're also doing the thing of putting a stumbling block before the blind man, which is maybe they're letting the blind man walk and they're not giving him vision and they're not poking out his eyes, but somehow they're like putting an apple in front of him that is really a wasp, right? They're tricking the man so that they're actually, it's not just this passive idea of letting the man walk into the cliff. They're somehow guiding the man with a false compass, that there are things out there that they're literally they're putting stumbling blocks in front of the blind man in this metaphor. And I feel like there's a necessary component to that I'm sure you'll want to speak about, is they're not just passively getting out of humans' way so they can be dumb. They're actively putting things in their path that are like temptations that will trigger their hubris and whatever other passions they have that they're slaves to. And they recognize, oh, this character, he's a slave to his vengeance. So we're going to give him a scenario where he's got to deal with vengeance and he's just going to fall right off the cliff, right? But they're putting that vengeance in place first. It's like they're setting a trap, as much as and I'm not sure if that's actually what we're saying either. It's more of a question here. Is it like a trap? Is it a stumbling block? Is it a cliff? Is it all of the above? Maybe it is, and I'm just overthinking it. But it seems to me like this also relates to, I want to say, the final thing about my thoughts on self-sufficiency versus self-authority. I was thinking also in the hungry model, which is very nice that I think it was Donald said about how they could just die. So that's self-authority. If they still have a self-authority, they can accept the conditions in front of them and be like, pardon my French, fuck this, right? We're gonna go in and we're not gonna take it. But self-sufficiency means, yeah, we don't have these resources. And I like the idea of here's Viktor Frankl's approach to meaning. He boils it down that the classic dichotomies between Freud and Adler is Adler's all about power, what you can actually do. So that would be how much authority you have in some ways, it seems. And Freud is just passions, like what we feel. So it's the will to desire, or the will to pleasure, or the will to power. But in Auschwitz, you didn't have any pleasure and you didn't have any power. And you would argue that if those were the two primary drives of man, then everybody would have died. Nobody would have survived. Yet a lot of people did survive when they, quote unquote, according to him, found meaning. And this is the distinction I'd make between authority and sufficiency. Is power and desire are like sufficiency. There's resources. If you have none of them, you think you automatically die. But the authority of man is still, how do I choose my perspective to these contingencies? I have no desire. I have nothing to desire. Everything's miserable. I have no choices. I have to, it's Auschwitz, concentration camp, right? You're just doing all these awful things, but I can still choose how I feel about that to some degree. I can laugh or I can cry. I can change my attitude. And so this is what he talks about, is the freedom of man, which maybe is the authority of man, is always to choose your perspective, even if you have no power or no self-sufficiency. Your authority can still be, I'm going to choose to find some meaning in here. I'm going to try to create a story of my choosing towards the suffering that I'm experiencing. And to me, this is the only authority man really has, is to choose his perspective on things rather than actually the things that we need to live. So.
That's great, Ari. Thank you. Yeah, that's the irreducible part. You can reduce a lot of other, capacity for agency that people have, but ultimately there's that protected core, which is in how we orient to it. I think you're right on in exploring the ambiguities around the question of to what extent were the Greek gods seen as just letting us fall off the cliff, and to what extent were they putting a cliff there in the first place. But kind of the concept in ancient Greece is that the gods are not above nature. So they're not doing counternatural things to set people up for failure, but they're merely expressing some part of the diversity of nature, and thus presenting us with a situation that an ideally self-sufficient animal should have been able to handle. But we don't, or can't. And the Greeks were not really, they didn't spend a lot of time being interested in examples where people were just physically swamped and had no choice. Like, you're living your own life and a volcano goes off under you and you burn to death, you die at the end. They don't tell stories like that. They like to tell stories where there was really nothing stopping people from doing the right thing other than their own benighted character and their unwillingness to grow and to learn from their mistakes. That's the kind of manipulation that the Greek gods did, is present people with parts of nature that they had been in denial about, but now had to confront, and they do or don't rise to the challenge. It's interesting stuff. The Greeks, and he gets into this starting in sentence 9, which we'll come to after our discussion. He's alluding to this idea that the relationship between the Greek deities and human beings it's not quite as possessive as the relationship between the medieval deities and their subjects. Whether it's the Jewish God or the Christian God or the Muslim God, these deities have very personal relationships with humanity in which they're like, you're my people, and I have a vested interest in what happens to you. Whereas the Greek gods were more like, we are part of nature. We are aspects of nature's authority. And you have evolved within this same natural context, but you're a little weird. And you're sort of stumbling around, sometimes doing the right thing and sometimes doing crazy things. And sometimes that's going to end well for you and sometimes that's going to end badly for you. But, despite the occasional myths like Prometheus and Epimetheus making human beings, generally the argument was that the Olympian deities did not create human beings. The Zeus and his kind, they didn't make us. We just sort of were stumbling into the world that is their world, and to which, from the Greek religious perspective, the Greek deities are better suited to survive within the realm of nature than Homo sapiens is. And so that's why their perspective on us is avuncular. It's like, oh, I don't know if you should do that, buddy. You might be sorry. What if someone were to stick a bench in front of you as you stumble forward in the dark? Oh, no, there you went. Yeah, well, could have seen that coming. So it was their goal to make the Greek deities give good advice, but not to give commandments, because we weren't really their people. I mean, they felt sorry for us. They didn't really wish us ill per se, but on the other hand, the number of times they saw us as creating disasters of our own making, and frequently despite very clear guidance to the contrary, you know, they're like, I don't know what to tell you, man. It's like when the Persian Empire invades Greece, or is planning to invade Greece, and the Persian emperor goes to consult Delphi to see if it's a good idea or a bad idea. And what does the oracle say? The oracle says, if Persia and Greece go to war, a mighty empire will fall. And what is the emperor here? That's great. I wanted the Greeks to fall. They are going to fall. And what is he missing from this picture? The Greeks aren't an empire. Persia's an empire. If the mighty empire is going to fall, it's not, that's going to be you, buddy. What is it? What kind of self-involvement does it take to hear that prediction and conclude that you're going to win? It's like the Greeks are like, the Greek gods are like, I don't know what to tell you. I told you what was going to happen. You didn't want to hear it. Catastrophe's on you, buddy. So it's like sort of an arm's length relationship that the Greek deities have with us. On the one hand, it's very intimate because nature interpenetrates us. It's everywhere. And all this stuff about the way that character governs us. Zeus is involved with that. Apollo's involved with that. Dionysus is involved with that. Artemis. There's all these deities that are directly involved right down to the level of our character. But on the other hand, that's that we're not their monkeys. This is what our activities do not constitute their circus. The best they can do is go, oh no, don't do that. Oh, never mind. I guess that was going to happen. It's hard to fully take in that kind of a relationship. It's very different from the theological relationships we're used to. But anyway, great comment. Sorry, thank you. Phil, what's on your mind? Come off mute.
Yeah, what's on my mind is what Donald said and what Ari said. They seem to be related, but I'll bring in a third dimension between self-sufficiency and self-governance. I'm bringing the contrast. Well, let's first address what Donald says. 80% of their energy is dependent on Russian oil and gas, and 20% is nuclear energy was the technicians are all Russian. So yeah, they're really in trouble. But you got to think of Ukraine that is even more dependent. They fought for self-governance. I'm thinking another thing. What is the relationship between Hungary of 2022 to 2025 versus the Hungary of 1956, when they were even more dependent on Russia? I mean, they decided to rebel and try to govern themselves. I mean, that was a real dependency. It's not the lights going off. It's about tanks rolling in. So I think that's important. What happened in those years that Hungary just became like a scaredy cat? What they were a wolf at 1956. That's it. I want to ask that question of Donald.
I think you've discovered, Phil, why many Greeks said courage is the primary virtue.
Yeah.
Yes. Parent of all the other virtues, because without courage, what is the point even? Anyway.
Good answer. Good answer, Donald.
That is a good answer. Thanks. Stephen, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Just going to push into the next paragraph, and the subject of dreams is mentioned. And this was the huge point of Friedrich Nietzsche, of course, when he started to doubt the rational preoccupations of the modern world. And still today, they're still at it. All the rationalists at work, we're still building the great pyramid of rationalism. One day, the mighty feat will be over and we'll have all the answers. And at first, dear old Nietzsche was a little bit with that project. And then he started to think about things a bit more deeply. He started to notice, well, it's a bit like Groundhog Day, actually, this rationalism. And he went in that completely different direction of dynamism, where he decided that no, what matters is a balance between conflicting forces. Rationalists don't perceive that. They see everything as a structure. We build the pyramid, okay? No problem. Nietzsche's saying, well, yeah, it's a nice tool on certain occasions, but there's a lot of us, a lot of what we are is involved as this balance between conflicting forces. And this seems to be a view that's almost diametrically opposed to rationalism. He went on, he sort of developed that basic theory of the subconscious, that our vitality doesn't come from the conscious mind. The rationalists decided everything's going to be solved when we get down to the town hall, we bicker for a few hours and we come up with a decision and we tell all the people to follow our thoughts. And Nietzsche's saying, no, there's no vitality in that. That's deaf. Consciousness is deaf. Vitality is found in the subconscious. And so that's the question here in the next paragraph, that say the ancient culture, they paid attention to stuff like dreams, whereas today we're told to dismiss dreams. We spend a good chunk of the day in this state of consciousness, but we're told, don't bother, it's a waste of time, it's rubbish. So that's in the next paragraph. Just a little effort to push you into the next paragraph. Thank you. Thank
you, Stephen. Well, with that, why don't I take us through the end of paragraph 14 so we can get into that next paragraph. There's really, only one central point I wanted to make out of sentences 9 through 11 out of paragraph 14, but let's go through them real quick, because there's a paradox at work in sentences 9 through 11. He says the Greek gods were thus at one and the same time far more moral and also far less than the Christian God. By way of myths and dreams, they supplied insight into wisdom, which was preeminently theirs to share for the sake of the metabolism of moral intelligence in the community at large. But they never dictated to men what ought to be done. Men have a right and a responsibility to exercise the virtuosity of their ultimate insight and judgment for themselves, being all the while in the hands of the daimonic powers, i.e. their character, or their ultimate and intuitive life energy. So what he's talking about here is that this word moral, and we've said this before, but he's now highlighting on the word moral. Moral is a potent word. What is morality? And what he's showing is it's hard for us as moderns to evaluate the Greek gods because we have our own ideas about what morality is. And when we have some sense of what the medieval concept of morality was, we really have no sense at all of what the Greek concept of morality was. And a lot of the medieval concept of morality was do what you're told or you go to hell. Right? I mean, you can add extra things that sound nicer to it, but if that's core to your theology, it really doesn't matter what icing you put on that cake. That's a cake about a dictatorial relationship between the divinity and the people who are subject to him. And from that perspective, morality is obedience. Right? You have obedience of the right authority, the good authority, and not obedience of the bad authorities. Right? From the medieval perspective, all these polytheistic deities were bad authorities who couldn't be trusted. They were demons. And this one deity was the correct authority that you should obey. So obey the right one and don't obey the wrong ones, and that's what morality is. So from that perspective, the ancient Greek gods were not moral at all, because they wouldn't tell anybody what to do in any kind of clear language. that's immoral for a God to do from that framework or that perspective. From the modern perspective, it's far more confused. So I won't even bother with that until we get into the last third of the book. But from the ancient Greek perspective, morality is about survival and life and vitality and health, and guiding people in the direction of greater vitality and health, and the wisdom that's required to recognize those things is the most moral thing you can do. Nothing's more moral than that. To get people to focus on the ways in which they're subject to their own character, in which they think that they have infinite freedom, but they don't. They're really just acting on the impulses from their character. And if they want to be a better person, they need to cultivate a better character. They need to look into that darkness within themselves and figure out what's going on in there, and then start working on what it takes to change the worst parts into better parts. Then nothing could be more moral than that from the Greek perspective. But that's not a medieval preoccupation, right? That's not what the medievals were concerned with. They were concerned with obedience. They had lists of things you were supposed to do. They had commandments. They had virtues. They had sins. They had all these things set up to tell you do these things and don't do those things. And so, from their perspective, the ancient Greek religion was immoral. Part of it is on this phrase, which was preeminently theirs to share. And this is another critical thing that Kenneth put that there for a reason. You want to note the difference between, in the medieval religion, God is moral, and man can only be moral by obeying God. And we shouldn't bother with the kind of heuristic self-cultivation. In fact, that's pride. It's a sin, and you'll go to hell and burn for all eternity. So the important thing from a medieval perspective was that God has all the morality, and through a delicate link of grace, you can inherit that morality by being obedient. But God keeps that morality himself. He remains the only moral source. No matter how you live your life from the medieval perspective, you'll never be a moral being. You might be a sinner or not a sinner. You might imitate God or not imitate God, but you yourself have no morality of your own worth speaking of. It's in your behavior. You do or you don't do the things you're supposed to do. But from the ancient Greek perspective, what's so fascinating is that the ancient Greeks want to share their morality. They understand the way that character governs us. They want to teach that to us so that we can learn to govern ourselves. They want to strengthen our autarkia and our autarkia. And by doing that, they want to enable us to become more moral beings than we were before we learned those things. And this concept of sharing morality is quite different from the medieval dictatorial concept, right? Because the more morality the ancient Greek deities share with the Greek people, and the more morality the Greek people are able to develop in themselves through the cultivation of their character, the less they need the Greek deities to tell them what to do. I.e., even if the Greek deities were inclined to be dictatorial, it would be increasingly redundant if under this schema, the Greek people were becoming more moral through self-cultivation. And thus, the need for the Greek deities would diminish. Now, the medieval God would see that as a threat if his morality was shared. I'm not talking about the modern conception of Christianity, but the medieval Christian concept of God was such that would be an invasion of God's authority to have to share any of it. It would be terrible if people didn't need God as much, because then maybe God couldn't control whether they went to heaven or hell. They would be deciding it for themselves. And that's the worst possible thing from a theological perspective, from the medieval standpoint. So this issue of sharing is very central to the revolution that happens in the overthrow of the classical worldview and the rise of the new medieval worldview, is this concept of we need to infantilize people by eliminating the possibility of autarkia, by eliminating the chance that people can cultivate themselves into being moral beings. We need to infantilize them and keep them endlessly dependent upon a dictatorial form of deity. And he will, and we have to do that because, and this is the medieval critique, is that whole framework of trying to teach people to govern themselves didn't work. I mean, just look at the Roman Empire. It's a disaster. People are too corruptible. So that doesn't work anymore. So we're not going to share it. We're not going to share morality with people anymore. People shouldn't even try for that. They should just see if they can just follow orders. If they could just follow the right orders, then we'll make a moral world. Huge inversion, right? This is a revaluation of values. And where he ends that in paragraph 14 in sentence 11, he's doing another one of his spliced sentences where each half of the sentence is alluding to an entire book worth of information. That thing about men have a right and a responsibility to exercise the virtuosity of their ultimate insight and judgment for themselves. He's basically saying human beings have a duty to mature into the mature adult form of Homo sapiens, because that form is what evolution intended for us. Just like cheetahs don't remain cubs, confused and vulnerable and somewhat incompetent as runners, they mature into the adult form because that's what evolution had in mind for. That's how they survive and thrive, is by growing into that. So Homo sapiens, people have a duty to grow beyond the Dulic and Banausic stages of development into the heuristic stage. They need to do that. Otherwise, what's the point of us? Why we aren't even reaching the stage at which we can survive. So on the one hand, he's talking about that. But on the other hand, even though that's about self-governance and self-cultivation, in the second half of the sentence, he's alluding back to the other half of the problem, which is that doing this never makes us free of our character. Ethos anthropoi daimon, says Heraclitus. We always remain subject to our character as though it was a god over us. It has that much authority over what we're going to do, controls what we notice, controls what we care about, influences us to act this way and not that way. We always remain dependent to that daimon. The question is, are we willing to cultivate that daimon into a better daimon so that what we're subject to improves over time? Now, can you imagine what would happen to you if you were a medieval theologian and you try to say, we have a responsibility to cultivate God into being a better God so that he'll rule us better? I mean, you'd burn at the stake, right? That's what would happen to you. But that is the core of the concept in the ancient Greek religion, is that your character is a god over you, and you have a duty to help that god grow up and become a better god, so you are being given better guidance. You have a better teleology, you have a better fate awaiting you. So he's splicing these things together to show that there's a dialectic between freedom and determinism in the Greek concept of character and intelligence and culture and the relationship between gods and men. It's very sophisticated. Phil, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
I just have a funny thought when you mention all that. We know the Catholic Church have confessionals, right? We all know that. And you're supposed to go and confess your sin. What if you came into the confession? Is that, Father, please forgive me because I have sinned. I had done something good. I did not read it in the scripture. I have sinned because I obviously did not do anything good. But I sinned because I had some pride about what I did, even though I didn't read it in the scriptures. Please forgive me and ask God to forgive me for my sin of pride in doing this, what I thought was a good deed, but obviously it was a sin.
Yes.
Could you imagine that? What would the priest say back to him? Yes, half a dozen Hail Marys and whatever. I mean, that would be a very funny story.
Yes. Thank you, Phil. Well, we are at the end of our 3 hours. It's as Ariola says, I say the same. This is the highlight of my week. Thank you all for spending this time with us and with Kenneth Smith's text. And we will pick this up again next week with paragraph 15, which Stephen tried to get us into, and we almost made it. But we'll be ready next time. We'll start with sentence 1. So,
goodbye, everybody. Lovely to see you.
Likewise.
Highlights.
All right.